The world here is drawn in heavy strokes of soft pastel on a surface of deep, lightless paper. It is a canvas dominated by shades of slate gray, bruised indigo, and the pale, dusty white of frozen breath. There are no borders to this landscape. The ice stretches outward in every direction, an endless, flat plateau that consumes the horizon. The sky presses down, a heavy lid of bruised atmosphere, thick with the weight of the cold. The cold here is not a mere condition of the weather. It is an absolute force. It has mass. It has a heavy, sinking weight that presses against the fabric of reality. It settles over the ice like a dense, invisible blanket, stealing warmth from everything it touches. The shadows cast by the small, uneven ridges of snow are deep and charcoal dark, stretching long across the frozen expanse. The surface of the ice is not soft. It is not the yielding snow of temperate winters. It is a hardened armor, compressed by thousands of years of relentless pressure and scoured by the unending wind. The wind is a constant presence. It does not howl or shriek. It is too vast for such sharp noises. Instead, it emits a low, continuous moan, a heavy, vibrating drone that travels across the flat, featureless miles. It is the sound of the continent breathing, a slow, exhausted exhalation that pushes the fine, crystalline dust of the ice across the plateau. The dust moves like pale smoke, catching the faint, weak light and obscuring the ground in a hazy, drifting fog of frost. The sound of the wind fills the ears, numbing the mind with its steady, unbroken rhythm. It was the deep interior of the year 1957 when the heavy shadows of the tractors first disturbed this ancient silence. They came from the coast, from the relative warmth of Vostok Station, crawling across the ice at an agonizingly slow pace. The journey was not measured in days, but in the slow, grinding revolutions of the metal treads against the hardened snow. The tractors were massive, heavy beasts of iron and steel, yet they appeared small and insignificant against the vastness of the plateau. They moved in a line, a slow-moving caravan of dark shapes against the pale gray ice. Inside the cabins, the men sat in silence, enveloped in layers of heavy, rough wool, feeling the constant, bone-rattling vibration of the engines struggling against the altitude and the cold. The cold invaded the machines just as it invaded the men. The heavy diesel fuel, the lifeblood of the engines, began to thicken. It lost its fluidity, turning into a dark, sluggish paste that refused to flow through the lines. The mechanics were forced to step out into the punishing air, armed with heavy blowtorches. The ignition of the torch provided a sudden, violent burst of warm color, a bright, ragged flame of yellow and orange that flared against the overwhelming blue and gray of the landscape. The flame licked the metal fuel lines, a desperate attempt to coax the thick grease back into liquid. The firelight danced across the frosted metal, casting frantic, flickering shadows that looked like hurried pencil sketches on the white snow. Then the torch would be extinguished, and the deep, cold colors would instantly swallow the warmth, leaving only the faint, bitter scent of burned kerosene in the heavy air. They stopped at a point on the map that possessed no geographic distinction: 78 degrees 27 minutes south, 106 degrees 52 minutes east. There were no mountains to block the wind, no valleys to offer shelter, no rocks to break the endless monotony of the white. It was simply a coordinate, a mathematical intersection on a blank, icy sphere. This was the place chosen for Station Vostok. They stopped the engines. The sudden absence of the mechanical roar was deafening. The silence of the plateau rushed in to fill the void, heavy and absolute, save for the eternal, low hum of the wind sweeping the ice dust around the heavy treads of the stationary machines. The work of unloading began. It was a slow, deliberate process, dictated by the absolute necessity of conserving energy. The men descended from the cabins. Their heavy, fur-lined boots met the surface of the ice. The snow did not crunch beneath their weight. The temperature was so low that the ice crystals had become as hard as sand. With every step, the snow squeaked, a sharp, high-pitched friction that sounded like breaking glass or the tearing of dry paper. The wooden panels of the station, brought piece by piece on the sledges, were heavy and rigid with frost. The men moved like slow, heavy specters, lifting the rough-hewn timber. Every exertion required a deep draw of the thin, freezing air. The air burned the lungs, turning instantly to a thick cloud of white steam upon exhalation, obscuring their faces in a drifting veil of their own freezing breath. Slowly, piece by heavy piece, a structure took shape. It was a small, fragile box resting on a miles-deep foundation of solid ice. The wooden walls were erected, the joints sealed against the intrusive wind. As the roof was laid and the heavy door finally pushed shut, the men stood inside the dark, freezing enclosure. It was a cavern of rough timber, smelling of raw pine and cold earth. They brought in a small kerosene lantern. The striking of the match was a loud snap in the confined space. The wick caught, and a small, wavering flame blossomed behind the soot-stained glass. The light from the lantern transformed the interior into a masterclass of chiaroscuro, reminiscent of an old charcoal and pastel drawing. The illumination was a warm, muted amber that struggled against the pervasive, deep blues and grays of the freezing air. The light washed over the rough texture of the wooden walls, highlighting the splinters and the fine layer of white hoarfrost that was already beginning to crystallize on the inner surface. The corners of the room remained steeped in impenetrable, pitch-black shadows. The lantern light caught the fibers of the men's thick woolen sweaters, the rime ice clinging to their thick beards, and the deep, exhausted lines etched into their faces. They looked like portraits drawn in soft dust, perfectly still, absorbing the faint warmth of the glowing wick. The iron stove was positioned in the center of the small room, a heavy, black anchor in the dim light. Lighting the stove was a slow ritual. The fuel burned with a low, crackling sound, radiating a concentrated, localized heat. The heat was a physical boundary. If a man stood close, his front would slowly begin to thaw, the ice on his coat melting into heavy drops of water that steamed in the dry air, while his back, turned toward the frost-covered walls, remained numb and rigid with cold. The men huddled around the black iron, their movements sluggish. They stretched out thick, heavily gloved hands toward the warm metal, seeking comfort in the slow transfer of thermal energy. There was very little movement, and even less conversation. Words required breath, and breath was a precious commodity, quickly lost to the cold. The air inside the small station was still, yet heavy with the sheer weight of the temperature just outside the thin wooden walls. The men sat on simple wooden crates, their postures hunched, shoulders drawn up toward their ears in an instinctual attempt to retain body heat. They existed in a state of suspended animation, their metabolism slowing, their minds drifting into a quiet, numb endurance. The only movement was the occasional, slow blink of an eye, or the gentle shifting of a heavy boot against the wooden floorboards. Beyond the walls, the wind continued its endless labor. The low moan of the air moving over the ice vibrated through the timber, a constant, tactile hum that could be felt in the soles of the feet and the palms of the hands. It was the rhythm of the station, a deep, resonant bass note that underscored the absolute isolation of their existence. Sometimes, the wind would drive the fine ice dust against the windward wall with a sound like a heavy, rushing stream. The dust would pack into the microscopic cracks in the wood, effectively sealing the men inside a tomb of ice and timber. Inside, the heavy silence absorbed these sounds, turning them into a distant, hypnotic lullaby. The scientific work, the entire justification for this freezing exile, was a study in monotonous repetition. The meteorologists unpacked the delicate instruments from their protective cases. The thermometers, housed in heavy glass tubes, were carefully mounted. Inside the tubes, the red spirit, chosen because mercury would freeze solid in this environment, began its slow, inevitable retreat. The red line shrank downwards, pulling away from the top of the glass, moving lower and lower as it registered the profound absence of thermal energy. The men watched the red line descend, a slow visual measurement of the hostile void they had chosen to inhabit. The numbers they recorded in the heavy, leather-bound ledgers were consistently, numbingly low. As the long hours stretched into a seamless, indistinguishable blur of time, the men prepared for sleep. The sleeping quarters were cramped, the bunks narrow and unforgiving. They climbed into heavy, dense sleeping bags, fully clothed in their thermal layers. The material of the bags was stiff and unyielding, chilled to the core. It required an hour of lying perfectly still, waiting for the body's faint heat to soften the fabric, waiting for the bag to begin reflecting warmth back to the skin. During that hour, the cold sought out every weakness. It settled heavily on exposed noses. It seeped through the small gaps around the shoulders. The men lay on their backs, staring up at the low timber ceiling. The faint light from the stove cast long, wavering shadows across the frost-rimed wood above them. The shadows stretched and pulled, dark, charcoal-like smudges against the gray and white frost, shifting slowly as the draft moved through the room. The breathing of the men eventually synchronized, falling into a slow, deep, collective rhythm. The sound of air slowly entering and leaving tired lungs became the metronome of the station. Outside, the wind maintained its low, steady moan, sweeping the ice dust across the thousands of miles of flat, unyielding plateau. Inside, the fire slowly burned down to embers, the amber light dimming, allowing the deep blue shadows to creep closer, wrapping the sleeping men in the heavy, silent, and endless cold of the long night. The transition from the deep, numb void of sleep to the waking reality of the station is a slow, reluctant fading. There is no sunrise to pierce the heavy, frosted windows, no sudden shift in the ambient light to signal the passage of time. The darkness inside the wooden structure remains a deep, dusty charcoal, clinging to the corners of the room like a heavy physical substance. The iron stove, once a beacon of warm, amber pastel light, has long since surrendered its heat. It sits in the center of the floor as a block of dead black mass, radiating an intense, sinking chill. The embers have faded to a dull, ashen gray, matching the color of the exhausted sky that presses down upon the roof. The cold, having waited patiently throughout the long hours, creeps back into the center of the room. It seeps through the microscopic fissures in the timber, migrating along the floorboards in heavy, invisible currents. It climbs the sides of the narrow bunks, feeling along the stiff, frozen canvas of the sleeping bags. The men inside are wrapped in cocoons of their own slow-fading warmth, their bodies curled tight, minimizing surface area. Every joint is locked in a dull, aching stiffness. To open an eye is to feel the immediate, sharp bite of the freezing air against the moisture of the cornea. The eyelashes, heavy with the crystallized condensation of their own sleeping breath, cling together. The rime ice binds the small hairs, requiring a deliberate, conscious effort to part the lids. When the eyes finally open, they are met with a ceiling that resembles a rough, unfinished sketch. The frost has grown overnight, stretching across the wooden planks in intricate fractal patterns of pale, chalky white. In the deep gloom, these frost patterns seem to float slightly above the dark wood, ghostly networks of frozen moisture that trace the subtle paths of the heavy, cold drafts moving through the sealed room. The silence is immense, broken only by the low, continuous drone of the exterior wind vibrating through the frozen timber walls. It is a deep, subsonic hum that bypasses the ears and settles directly into the bones. Slowly, the first man begins to move. The sound of this movement is not the soft rustle of fabric, but a harsh, dry crinkling. The heavy wool and canvas layers, stiffened by the profound drop in temperature, resist the body's commands. They groan and creak like the rigging of a frozen ship. The man pushes himself up, his breath instantly forming a thick, dense cloud of white vapor that hangs suspended in the still, freezing air. The vapor does not dissipate, it slowly sinks, the microscopic ice crystals raining down upon the heavy blankets in a silent, invisible snowfall. The physical effort of sitting upright demands a toll. The chest heaves, pulling in the thin, sub-zero air. The air enters the lungs like swallowed glass, a sharp, burning sensation that triggers a weak, ragged cough. The cough echoes dull and flat in the small, crowded space, absorbed quickly by the frost and the heavy clothing. There are no greetings spoken. The vocal cords are thick and sluggish, and the sheer effort of articulation is deemed an unnecessary expenditure of energy. The men simply exist in a shared, silent endurance. They sit on the edges of their bunks, heavy silhouettes against the slightly less dark wall, their shoulders slumped under the invisible, crushing weight of the atmospheric pressure and the biting cold. They look like statues carved from rough, gray stone, waiting for the blood to slowly thin and begin its lethargic circulation through their numb, aching limbs. The primary duty of the waking hour is the resurrection of the fire. The designated man forces his feet into the heavy, fur-lined boots that have sat on the floor overnight. The leather is as hard as iron, entirely unforgiving to the touch. He stomps his feet against the frost-covered planks, a dull, heavy thudding sound that barely registers over the constant drone of the wind. He shuffles toward the center of the room, his movements clumsy and uncoordinated. He kneels before the black iron stove. His thick, heavily insulated gloves make every task a slow, imprecise struggle. He opens the iron door. The hinges scream, a sharp metallic shriek that tears through the heavy silence. Inside the belly of the stove, the white ashes are perfectly still. He takes a long wooden match, his stiff fingers gripping it with dull force. The strike of the match head against the coarse paper is a loud, abrasive scrape. Suddenly, a spark catches. A small, violent flare of sulfurous yellow and burnt orange erupts in the darkness. This tiny point of light instantly alters the composition of the room. It casts deep, frantic shadows that leap up the walls, distorting the shapes of the bunks and the sitting men. The light is a warm, desperately needed pastel stroke against the vast canvas of cold grays and indigo blues. It catches the edges of the frost on the walls, making the ice crystals glitter with a brief, deceptive warmth. He touches the flame to a small wad of oil-soaked waste. The fire hesitates, the thick oil reluctant to ignite in the extreme cold. Slowly, a heavy, dark flame takes hold, accompanied by a thick plume of black smoke. He adds small pieces of frozen wood, listening to the hissing pop as the moisture within the timber is violently boiled away. The fire grows, painting the kneeling man in stark chiaroscuro, his face a landscape of deep, exhausted lines illuminated by the flickering amber glow, while his back remains swallowed by the immense, heavy darkness of the freezing room. As the iron of the stove begins its slow climb in temperature, the men begin the process of preparing for the outside. It is an act of armoring oneself against an environment that actively drains life. Layer upon layer of dense wool is pulled over thermal undergarments. Sweaters with rolled collars are tugged over heads, the rough fibers scratching numb skin. Over the wool goes windproof canvas, stiff and noisy, designed to blunt the penetrating force of the wind. Finally, the heavy fur parkas are donned. The garments are incredibly heavy, adding dead weight to frames already exhausted by maintaining a basal temperature. The men wrap woolen scarves around their faces, leaving only a narrow slit for the eyes. Their breath condenses and freezes within the fibers, forming an icy shell directly against their lips. They pull the fur-lined hoods over their heads, tunneling their vision and muffling the dampened sounds of the room. They stand near the door, a group of massive, shapeless figures, anonymous under layers of hide and cloth. Their eyes are fixed on the heavy wooden planks, the only barrier between their artificially heated space and the total void of the Antarctic plateau. The door is locked shut by a thick layer of frost formed around the frame during the night. Opening the door requires the combined strength of two men. They press their heavy, padded shoulders against the wood and heave. The ice shatters with a sharp, explosive crack, sounding like a rifle shot in the confined space. The door swings outward, and the outside world rushes in. It is not merely a draft of cold air. It is a physical wall of freezing density that hits the men with the force of a solid object. The air is so cold that it immediately sucks the breath from their lungs, replacing it with a painful, stinging vacuum. The light outside is a dim, diffused, chalky gray. There are no shadows on the ice, for there is no direct source of light. The sky and the ground blend together in a seamless, unbroken continuum of bruised, dusty white. It is a world drawn entirely in smudged, monochromatic pastels, lacking any sharp definitions or warm hues. The wind is waiting. It catches the men as they step out onto the hard-packed snow. The wind does not blow. It pours over the plateau in a heavy, endless river of sub-zero atmosphere. It carries with it the fine, microscopic dust of the ice, tiny abrasive particles that scour the exposed slivers of skin around the eyes with the intensity of sandblasting. The men lower their heads, leaning their heavy bodies forward against the invisible pressure of the wind, fighting for every inch of forward progress. Their boots squeak loudly against the dry, compacted snow, a harsh, mechanical friction that echoes hollowly in the vast, empty space. The heavy fur of their parkas ruffles violently, but the men themselves move with a slow, agonizing deliberation, conserving every ounce of forward momentum. The destination is the meteorological screen, a small wooden box mounted on stilts a short distance from the main hut. It appears as a fragile speck against the overwhelming immensity of the frozen horizon. The walk to the screen feels like an eternity. The cold penetrates the heavy boots, turning toes into numb lumps. It seeps through tiny seams in the canvas, tracing freezing paths across the skin. The man assigned to read the instruments reaches the box. His thick gloves fumble with the small metal latch. The metal is so intensely cold it feels like burning iron. He pulls open the slatted doors. Inside, the glass instruments hang suspended in the gloom. He leans in, his frosted breath threatening to obscure the tubes. He squints through the slit of his hood, focusing on the thin red column of colored alcohol inside the minimum thermometer. He traces the red line down, past the black markings of -40, past absolute zero on the scale, down into deep numbers that denote an environment utterly hostile to life. The red fluid has contracted, retreating deep into the bulb, a visual manifestation of the heat stripped entirely from the world. He carefully closes the small wooden doors. The latch snaps shut with a dull, frozen click. The wind howls around the stilts, carrying the heavy, monotonous sound out across the endless miles of ice. The turn away from the wooden instrument screen is a slow, agonizing pivot of the entire body. The heavy layers of canvas and dense animal fur resist the twisting motion, stiffened into a rigid armor by the profound absence of thermal energy in the surrounding atmosphere. As the man turns his back to the invisible, rushing force of the wind, the physical relief is negligible. The air does not simply push. It surrounds, it envelops, it seeks out every microscopic weakness in the fabric and every tiny gap between the heavy scarf and the edge of the frozen hood. The station, a mere 70 paces away, appears as a small, insignificant smudge of dark charcoal drawn hastily against the vast, smudged pastel canvas of the unbroken white and gray plateau. It offers no visual comfort, only the stark reminder of its fragile existence in a landscape that actively works to erase it. The walk back requires the same slow, deliberate exertion as the walk out. The heavy, fur-lined boots drag against the compacted surface. The snow here does not compress underfoot. It is baked by the cold into a substance harder than packed earth, possessing the dry, abrasive texture of fine glass dust. Every step produces a sharp, high-pitched mechanical squeak, a harsh friction that is immediately swallowed by the low, continuous moan of the sweeping wind. The man leans backward slightly now, using the solid wall of the wind to support his exhausted weight, letting the relentless pressure push him toward the dark, rectangular outline of the wooden door. The sky above remains a heavy, bruised lid of dusty indigo and flat gray, indistinguishable from the horizon, a seamless void of frozen air that offers no depth and casts no natural shadows. The physical toll of this brief exposure is profound and entirely silent. Inside the heavy chest, the lungs ache with a dull, burning sensation. The air drawn through the frozen woolen scarf is dangerously thin and profoundly cold, stripping moisture and heat from the delicate internal tissues with every shallow inhalation. The body, in its blind, instinctual panic to preserve the vital organs, has long since constricted the blood vessels in the extremities. The fingers, buried deep within thick layers of wool and leather, feel nothing but a heavy, wooden numbness. The toes have ceased to register the pressure of the boots. The man moves forward purely on the momentum of rote memory and the ingrained, inescapable weight of duty. The mind narrows, shrinking down to the simple, repetitive focus of placing one heavy foot in front of the other. The distance closes with agonizing slowness. The rough-hewn timber of the station's exterior wall slowly comes into focus, its surface scoured pale by the endless abrasive blasting of the microscopic ice crystals. The tiny, frost-choked window is a blind, white eye staring out into the emptiness. The man reaches the heavy wooden door. The thick leather of his glove meets the freezing iron of the handle. There is no sensation of touch, only the dull transmission of force. He pulls the heavy latch, the metal grinding with a stiff, reluctant shriek that vibrates through his rigid arm. The door opens outward, tearing the seal of fresh frost that has already begun to form in the brief minutes he has been outside. He steps over the raised threshold and into the narrow, unheated vestibule. This is the airlock, a tiny transitional chamber of raw wood and deep shadows that separates the absolute lethality of the plateau from the marginal survival of the interior room. The heavy outer door is pulled shut behind him. The sudden cessation of the wind's physical pressure is jarring. The deafening, subsonic roar of the moving air is instantly muted, reduced to a heavy, muffled vibration in the wooden walls. The silence of the vestibule is thick and dusty. The temperature here is still far below zero, but the air is still. The man stands in the pitch-black space, a massive, frost-covered silhouette. He raises his heavy, numb arms and begins to beat his gloved hands against his thick canvas parka. The dry, crystalline snow, packed tightly into the coarse weave of the fabric by the wind, shatters and falls away. It sounds like handfuls of dry sand being thrown against a stretched drumskin. The fine white dust falls to the wooden floorboards, invisible in the darkness but felt beneath the heavy soles of the boots. He brushes the accumulated rime ice from his shoulders and the thick fur of his hood. The process is slow, methodical, and entirely necessary. Any snow carried into the heated interior will instantly melt, soaking the precious layers of clothing in water that will slowly steal the body's fragile heat and freeze again when the fires die down. He spends long, silent minutes in the dark, ensuring the canvas is completely clear of the clinging frost. Only then does he reach for the inner door. He pushes it open, and the weak, amber glow of the main room spills into the dark vestibule. The air inside the station hits him. It is heavily scented with the acrid smell of burning kerosene, the deep, musky odor of damp wool, and the metallic tang of the heated iron stove. To a body returning from the deep void, this air feels momentarily thick and stifling, yet the actual temperature in the room barely hovers above freezing. He steps inside, pulling the inner door shut, sealing the small, fragile bubble of atmospheric pressure. The unlayering begins. It is a slow, clumsy shedding of heavy skins. The thick gloves are pulled off with the teeth, revealing hands that are pale, stiff, and clumsy. The heavy parka is unbuttoned with awkward, numb fingers that struggle to grasp the large wooden toggles. The canvas shell is peeled away and hung on a heavy wooden peg near the door, where it hangs like a discarded, frozen husk. The woolen scarf, stiff with the frozen condensation of his own breath, is unwrapped from the face. The ice crumbles and falls to the floor as the fabric bends. The man stands in his thick woolen sweaters, his face a portrait drawn in deep charcoal lines of exhaustion, his skin flushed a bruised, mottled purple from the punishing cold. He moves toward the iron stove, drawn by the primal, magnetic pull of the weak heat radiating from the black metal. He does not stand too close. To warm numb flesh too quickly is to invite a deep, agonizing pain as the sluggish blood is forced forcefully back into the constricted capillaries. He stands at a safe distance, letting the ambient, dusty warmth slowly permeate the heavy layers of wool, waiting for the slow, prickling ache that signals the return of circulation to his hands and face. The duty is not complete until the numbers are transferred from the fragile memory of the mind to the permanent record of the station. The man moves away from the stove and sits heavily on a simple wooden stool drawn up to a small, rough-hewn desk. The desk is situated in the corner of the room, far from the stove, steeped in the deep, heavy shadows of the pastel gloom. A small, soot-stained oil lamp provides a localized pool of weak, yellow illumination on the rough surface of the wood. Resting in the center of this light is the meteorological ledger. It is a massive, heavy book, bound in thick, stiff leather that is cold to the touch. The pages are heavy, archival paper designed to withstand the damp and the cold. He opens the heavy cover. The pages turn with a dry, stiff rustle. He finds the current date, a date that holds no meaning in this endless continuum of dark and cold. He reaches for the pen. It is a simple dip pen, the wooden shaft worn smooth by constant use. Beside it sits a small, heavy glass inkwell. The ink inside the glass is a thick, dark liquid, sluggish and resistant to movement. The extreme cold of the corner has thickened the fluid, turning it into a dense, viscous sludge. The man must wrap his hands around the cold glass, using the faint, lingering heat of his palms to coax the ink back into a usable state. It takes minutes of silent, patient waiting. He stares blankly at the dark fluid, his mind empty, suspended in the heavy, static atmosphere of the room. Finally, the ink loosens enough to coat the steel nib. He dips the pen, the metal scratching softly against the bottom of the glass well. He brings the nib to the heavy paper. The physical act of writing is a slow, labored process. His fingers are still stiff, lacking the fine motor control required for smooth script. He presses the nib down, dragging the thick, dark ink across the page. The scratching sound of the metal on the heavy paper fills the quiet corner, a sharp, rhythmic ticking that stands out against the low, distant moan of the wind outside. He writes the numbers he memorized at the screen. They are not merely digits. They are a bleak, mathematical confirmation of their profound isolation. He records the temperature, drawing the minus sign with a heavy, deliberate stroke, followed by numbers that plunge deep into the 70s. He records the barometric pressure, the heavy weight of the freezing atmosphere pressing down upon the ice. He records the wind speed, the endless, relentless force that scours the plateau. The ink dries almost instantly in the dry, freezing air, sinking deep into the fibers of the paper. The column of numbers looks like a list of casualties, a quiet, orderly record of the environment's unending hostility. When the last digit is drawn, he carefully wipes the steel nib on a scrap of rough cloth and closes the heavy leather cover. The dull thud of the book closing is swallowed by the shadows. The record is complete. The history of this frozen hour is secured. The recording of the data is followed by the agonizingly slow ritual of creating water. Hydration is a constant, desperate need in the incredibly dry air of the plateau, yet the surrounding landscape, made entirely of frozen water, offers nothing freely. The raw material must be harvested and violently altered. Another man, moving with the same heavy, lethargic slowness, brings in a block of hard-packed snow cut from the deep tunnel beneath the station. The block is perfectly square, pure white, and incredibly dense. It looks like a heavy stone carved from pale marble. He places a large, blackened aluminum pot on the flat top of the iron stove. The metal of the pot is instantly chilled by the contact. He lifts the heavy block of snow and drops it into the pot. The sound is a dull, solid clunk, devoid of any wetness or splash. Now, the waiting begins again. The transfer of heat from the weak embers inside the stove, through the thick iron, through the blackened aluminum, and into the dense matrix of the frozen snow is a process measured in long, silent fractions of an hour. The men sit around the stove, their faces illuminated by the dim, flickering amber light of the lantern, watching the pot with a vacant, hypnotic stare. The room is perfectly still. The shadows on the walls are long and deep, resembling smudged charcoal strokes that stretch and warp with the microscopic shifting of the lantern flame. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, the bottom layer of the snow block begins to yield. A faint, high-pitched hissing sound emerges from the pot, the sound of the microscopic ice crystals violently fracturing as they are forced to absorb the thermal energy. The sharp edges of the white block begin to soften, rounding off as the structure collapses inward. A shallow pool of dark, freezing liquid forms at the bottom of the pot. The process is painfully slow, fighting against the ambient cold of the room that constantly attempts to pull the temperature back below the freezing point. The men do not speak. They listen to the slow, agonizing hiss of the melting ice, a sound that becomes a focal point in the heavy silence. As the volume of water increases, it begins to slowly heat. A thin, wispy vapor begins to rise from the surface of the dark liquid. It is not steam. The water is nowhere near boiling. It is merely condensation, the warmer air immediately above the water colliding with the freezing air of the room. The vapor rises in slow, twisting tendrils, catching the amber light of the lantern, looking like faint, moving sketches drawn in pale, dusty chalk against the deep charcoal background of the room. The smell of the melting snow fills the air, a flat, metallic scent, utterly devoid of the minerals and life found in the water of the temperate world. It is the smell of ancient, sterile ice, millions of years old, brought back into liquid form through sheer, stubborn human effort. The water is finally poured into heavy tin mugs. The metal of the mugs instantly absorbs the heat, burning the lips even as the liquid inside remains lukewarm and flat. The men drink slowly, deliberately, the tepid water soothing the dry, aching tissues of their throats. They sit holding the warm tin, letting the heat seep into their stiff hands. The primary tasks of the cycle are complete. The data is recorded, the bodies are marginally hydrated. What remains is the long, unbroken stretch of time until the next reading. The heavy, dark atmosphere of the room settles deeply around them. The cold, temporarily pushed back by the stove, waits patiently in the corners, maintaining its silent pressure against the frost-covered walls. The men slump back on their simple wooden crates, their bodies heavy with the profound exhaustion of merely existing in this space. They stare into the dim, ashen remains of the fire. The amber light slowly fades, replaced by the deep, bruise-colored shadows of the pastel gloom. The continuous, heavy drone of the wind vibrating through the timber walls becomes a hypnotic, rhythmic pulse. The boundaries between waking and sleeping begin to blur. The mind, starved of sensory input and battered by the constant physical strain, drifts into a numb, suspended state of quiet, thoughtless endurance. They sit perfectly still, heavy figures in a dark, frozen room, waiting for the slow, inevitable turn of the clock to demand their movement once again. The passing of time in the deep interior of the continent is not marked by the turning of pages on a calendar or the shifting of light across the floorboards. As the calendar slowly drags toward the absolute midpoint of the long, frozen year, the pale, dusty gray that once delineated the sky from the crushed ice of the plateau is slowly, inexorably drained away. It is replaced by an immense, suffocating absence of illumination. The darkness that settles over the station is not merely the absence of the sun. It is a heavy, physical substance that presses against the thin wooden walls with the density of deep water. The world outside becomes a masterclass in the absolute darkest shades of the pastel box. It is a continuous, unbroken expanse of bruised, midnight indigo and crushed, powdery black, smudged together by the relentless, invisible friction of the moving air. There is no horizon. There is no separation between the frozen ground and the heavy, crushing weight of the atmosphere above. To look out through the tiny, frost-choked window is to stare directly into a void drawn in heavy, unyielding charcoal, a space utterly devoid of depth, perspective, or the faintest hint of warmth. The sun has slipped below the curve of the earth, leaving behind a profound, static night that will stretch unbroken for months. The psychological weight of this endless dark is a tangible pressure within the small, crowded room. It seeps into the heavy, stagnant air, slowing the already sluggish thoughts of the men, dampening their movements, and wrapping their minds in a thick, lethargic fog of silent endurance. Inside the fragile wooden box, the struggle against the creeping, pervasive cold is a slow, losing battle measured in microscopic increments of frozen moisture. The air within the station, heavily laden with the evaporated condensation of their boiling snow and the continuous, desperate exhalations of their own lungs, collides with the freezing timber of the walls. The result is a slow, relentless accumulation of rime and frost. The interior of the station slowly transforms from a rough-hewn wooden cabin into a cave of pale, dusty ice. The frost begins in the darkest corners, where the weak, amber glow of the central stove fails to reach. It grows in intricate fractal patterns, looking like delicate sketches drawn in pale, chalky white against the blackened timber. Slowly, day by monotonous day, these chalky sketches expand, their borders creeping outward, joining together to form a solid, crystalline armor over the wood. The frost absorbs the weak light of the lantern, diffusing it, turning the walls into a dim, ghostly canvas of smudged grays and stark whites. The room feels smaller now, the walls literally closing in as the ice thickens by millimeters. To lean against the wall is to feel the immediate, biting shock of solid ice through the heavy layers of wool. The timber itself, contracted to its absolute physical limit by the extreme negative temperatures, groans and cracks in the heavy silence. The sounds are sharp and sudden, like the snapping of thick bones, echoing flatly in the confined space before being swallowed once again by the constant, low, vibrating hum of the exterior wind. The maintenance of life in this frozen void requires power, and the source of that power lies completely outside the meager comfort of the main living quarters. Deep within the heavy, dragging hours of the polar night, the rhythm of the station demands that the mechanical heart be checked. The men sit perfectly still around the fading embers of the stove, wrapped in their thick, heavy sweaters, staring blankly at the dark iron. The unspoken realization that the generator must be tended passes between them without a single word. It is merely another heavy weight added to the burden of their exhausted bodies. One man slowly, agonizingly, begins the familiar ritual of armoring himself against the void. He moves like a figure moving underwater, the thick, damp wool resisting his sluggish muscles. He pulls the stiff, freezing canvas over his shoulders, the fabric scraping and protesting with a harsh, dry friction. He wraps the heavy, frost-stained scarf around his face, sealing out the warm, stagnant air of the room. The transition through the dark, unheated airlock is a brief plunge into absolute sensory deprivation, before he pushes his heavy, insulated shoulder against the outer door. The ice that seals the frame shatters with a loud, percussive crack. He steps out into the monolithic blackness of the exterior. The cold hits him not as a temperature, but as a solid, monolithic slab of crushing density. It instantly, violently strips away the thin layer of warmth trapped beneath his canvas shell. He carries a heavy, military-issue flashlight, its metal casing wrapped tightly in thick cloth to prevent the freezing steel from instantly adhering to the leather of his gloves. He depresses the heavy rubber switch. The beam of light that cuts through the darkness is thick and pale, filled with the swirling, chaotic motion of millions of microscopic ice crystals driven by the wind. The light does not illuminate a landscape. It merely highlights the rushing, abrasive river of frozen dust that scours the flat plateau. The beam looks like a solid stroke of pale yellow pastel pushed forcefully through a canvas of absolute black. He leans his heavy, shapeless body into the invisible wall of the wind, letting the relentless pressure hold him upright as he drags his heavy, fur-lined boots across the dry, squeaking snow. The generator shed is a small, solitary structure situated 50 paces from the main hut, connected only by a thick, heavy black cable that lies buried beneath the hardened drifts. The walk is a slow, rhythmic exertion of pure willpower. The wind howls around the edges of his thick fur hood, a deafening, monotonous roar that vibrates in his jaw and rattles the teeth in his skull. The air he draws through his scarf feels like inhaled slivers of jagged ice, burning the delicate tissues of his throat and settling as a heavy, freezing ache deep within his lungs. He counts his steps in the blinding, swirling dark, relying on the numb, mechanical memory of his exhausted legs to find the small, frozen wooden door of the shed. The interior of the generator shed is a profound, echoing chamber of raw cold and heavy mechanical odors. There is no stove here, no source of ambient heat. The air is stagnant, heavy with the sharp, metallic scent of frozen iron, the thick, acrid smell of spilled diesel fuel, and the faint, dusty odor of ozone. The man sweeps the pale beam of his flashlight across the small space. In the center sits the massive, cast-iron bulk of the diesel generator. It resembles a slumbering, prehistoric beast, its metallic surfaces completely coated in a thick, velvety layer of white hoarfrost. The cold here is somehow different from the cold of the open plateau. It is still, silent, and deeply penetrating, lacking the violent, abrasive force of the wind, but possessing a heavy, sinking density that immediately attacks the joints and the marrow. The man approaches the heavy machine. His movements are slow and deliberate, hampered by the thick, restrictive layers of his gloves. He must check the thick, viscous oil that serves as the lifeblood of the engine. He pulls a heavy metal dipstick from the casing. The oil clings to the metal, completely stripped of its fluidity. It is a thick, dark, gelatinous sludge, resembling frozen tar more than liquid lubricant. He stares at it in the pale light, the profound low temperatures of the room confirming the fragile, precarious nature of their continued survival. To keep this heavy iron beast turning requires constant, agonizing friction against the paralyzing grip of the cold. The engine is running, a slow, heavy, thunderous thrum that dominates the small space. The sound is not a clean, mechanical purr, but a deep, labored pounding, the rhythmic concussion of heavy metal struggling against the immense viscosity of the frozen lubricants. The massive pistons rise and fall with a sluggish, reluctant force. The entire wooden structure of the shed vibrates with the heavy, low-frequency rhythm, a steady, hypnotic pounding that travels down through the floorboards, into the compacted ice, and up through the thick soles of the man's boots. He places his heavily gloved hand against the frost-covered casing, feeling the deep, continuous tremor of the combustion. The exhaust pipe, a thick iron cylinder piercing the roof of the shed, vents a continuous stream of black, noxious smoke into the pure, freezing air outside. The heat of the exhaust is immediately violently attacked by the absolute cold of the night, the dark smoke instantly freezing and falling back to the ice as a heavy, invisible rain of frozen soot. The man stands in the dark, vibrating shed, bathed in the pale, dusty light of his flashlight, completely enveloped in the deafening, rhythmic roar of the heavy machinery. The sound acts as a sensory anchor in the formless void of the polar night, a deep, monotonous heartbeat that drowns out the howling of the wind and fills the empty, exhausted spaces of his mind. He watches the heavy belts turn, their rubber stiff and brittle, cracking slightly as they rotate over the frozen iron pulleys. Satisfied that the heavy machine will continue its slow, agonizing labor for another few hours, he turns away from the thumping iron mass. The process of leaving the shed is a slow, deliberate reversal of his arrival. He pulls the heavy wooden door shut, the frozen hinges shrieking loudly against the deep pounding of the engine. The wind immediately grabs him, wrapping its heavy, invisible arms around his thick canvas shell, seeking to strip away whatever tiny fraction of heat he has managed to generate through his movements. He turns his back to the rushing force, using the solid pressure of the moving air to push him back along the invisible path toward the main hut. He does not need the pale beam of the flashlight now. He simply follows the heavy, black cable buried beneath the squeaking snow, and the deep, low-frequency vibration of the generator that travels through the dense, compacted ice. The walk back is a silent, mindless slog through the heavy, dragging dark. The cold penetrates deeper now, the initial shock having worn off, replaced by a deep, numbing ache that settles permanently into the heavy bones of his legs and arms. The tiny, frost-choked window of the main hut appears out of the swirling blackness, a faint, smudged square of deep, dusty amber light. It is a weak, fragile beacon in the immense void, offering no real warmth, only the promise of a marginally less lethal environment. He passes through the dark, freezing airlock, the heavy outer door sealing behind him with a dull, heavy thud. The transition back into the heated space of the main room is a slow, painful thawing. As the thick, heavy layers of canvas and wool are slowly peeled away and hung on the frost-covered wooden pegs, the sluggish blood is forced back into the constricted capillaries of his extremities. The sensation is not relief, but a deep, agonizing, burning ache that throbs in time with his slow, heavy heartbeat. He moves toward the central iron stove, his body heavy and completely drained of energy. The other men have not moved. They remain seated on their simple wooden crates, heavy silhouettes drawn in deep, smudged charcoal against the pale, frost-covered walls. They exist in a state of suspended animation, their eyes open but unseeing, their minds adrift in a blank, thoughtless torpor. The man sits heavily on his own crate, joining the silent, staring circle. The deep, heavy rhythm of the distant generator can be felt as a faint, continuous vibration in the floorboards beneath their boots, a dull, hypnotic pulse that merges with the constant, low drone of the wind, vibrating the timber walls. The faint, amber light of the lantern casts long, deep shadows that stretch and warp across the chalky white frost, twisting and settling like tired, heavy spirits. The men sit perfectly still, anchored to the dying heat of the black iron, surrendering their minds to the slow, heavy, endless loop of the cold, dark, and perfectly silent passage of the frozen hours. The sensation of hunger in this deep, frozen abyss does not arrive with the sharp, demanding pangs known to the temperate world. It is, instead, a dull, spreading ache, a heavy, hollow sinking deep within the center of the mass. The body, constantly under siege by the absolute zero of the environment, burns through its internal fuel with a silent, desperate ferocity, cannibalizing its own reserves merely to keep the vital organs pulsing in the dark. The men do not feel an appetite. They feel a mechanical necessity, a warning light flickering in the sluggish, numb machinery of their exhausted minds. The acknowledgement of this need does not spark conversation or eager movement. It simply dictates the next agonizing sequence of heavy, deliberate actions required to sustain their fragile existence within the wooden box. The transition from sitting perfectly still to beginning the ritual of nourishment is slow. The designated man pushes himself up from his rough wooden crate. His heavy woolen joints creak in protest in the quiet room. He does not look at his companions. He moves with the slow, shuffling gait of a somnambulist, his heavy, fur-lined boots dragging across the floorboards that are permanently coated in a fine, chalky layer of dry frost. The primary food stores are not kept within the heated perimeter of the main living quarters. To share the precious, localized warmth of the iron stove with inanimate supplies would be a fatal miscalculation of thermal economics. The provisions are kept in a separate, unheated chamber, accessible through a low, heavy wooden door situated in the deepest, darkest corner of the vestibule. The man steps out of the main room, leaving the weak, amber glow of the lantern behind. He plunges back into the pitch-black, freezing airlock. He feels his way along the rough-hewn timber wall, his thick gloves brushing against the rime ice until his fingers locate the heavy iron latch of the storage door. The metal is brutally cold, a solid block of frozen mass that instantly saps the faint heat from his palm. He pulls the latch. The door resists, sealed shut by the relentless accumulation of atmospheric moisture that freezes the moment it contacts the wood. He presses his heavy shoulder against the planks and shoves. The ice breaks with a dull, flat snap, a sound that resembles the breaking of dry, ancient bones. He pulls the door open and steps down into the tunnel. The storage area is not a constructed room, but a cavity carved directly into the ancient, compacted ice of the plateau beneath the station. Here, beneath the surface, the wind cannot reach, but the cold is absolute and eternal. It is a tomb of perfect preservation, a static, unchanging vault where the temperature hovers at a constant, crushing -60 degrees. The man carries his heavy, cloth-wrapped flashlight. He presses the rubber button, and the pale, dusty beam of light cuts through the absolute blackness. The walls of the ice tunnel appear in the beam, lacking any sparkle or gleam. The ice here is so old and so densely compressed that it absorbs the light, presenting a surface of flat, matte white that looks exactly like thick, heavy strokes of soft pastel dragged forcefully across a dark canvas. The air in the tunnel is perfectly still, heavy, and completely devoid of any scent. There is no decay here, no growth, no microscopic life to give the air texture. It is the smell of a perfect, sterile void. The provisions are stacked along the walls like bricks in a forgotten cellar. Sacks of flour and grain rest on the ice, frozen into solid, unyielding boulders. Wooden crates of tinned meat and vegetables are stacked shoulder-high, their rough surfaces coated in a fine, permanent layer of hoarfrost that sparkles weakly in the pale beam of the flashlight. He moves toward the crates. Retrieving the food is a labor of blunt force. The tins are frozen together, bound by microscopic layers of ice that act like industrial adhesive. He must use a heavy, short-handled iron crowbar to pry the necessary tins from the frozen mass. He strikes the wooden crate, the sound of the iron hitting the frozen timber ringing out with a sharp, metallic ping that echoes flatly down the length of the ice tunnel. He wedges the cold iron between two cylindrical tins and leans his heavy weight onto the bar. The ice cracks, a sharp, sudden release of tension, and a single heavy tin rolls free. It hits the ice floor with the solid, dead sound of a dropped stone. The metal of the tin is completely covered in white frost, hiding the faded paper labels. He does not know, nor does he particularly care, what specific preserved meat or vegetable the tin contains. In this environment, flavor is a distant, forgotten luxury. Only caloric density matters. He gathers 3 of the heavy, frozen cylinders, clutching them clumsily against his chest with his thick gloves. He also retrieves a solid block of butter from a torn cardboard box. The butter is indistinguishable from a block of pale yellow marble, hard enough to shatter a tooth if bitten, cold enough to instantly burn the unprotected skin of a bare hand. He turns back toward the low wooden doorway, his breath forming slow, heavy clouds of white dust in the pale light, leaving the silent, perfect preservation of the ice tunnel behind him. Returning to the main room, he carries the frozen mass of supplies to the iron stove. The room feels marginally warmer after the absolute, stagnant cold of the ice vault, though the deep shadows in the corners remain heavily painted in smudged indigo and charcoal gray. He places the frozen tins directly onto the flat, black iron surface of the stove. The sound of the violently cold metal contacting the heated iron is a sharp, aggressive hiss. The frost on the outside of the tins instantly sublimates, flashing from solid white ice into a thick, twisting cloud of gray vapor. The vapor smells of scorched dust and hot iron. Now, the agonizingly slow process of state alteration begins. They cannot simply open the tins. The contents inside are frozen into a single, solid block of dense, organic matter. To force a knife into the tin would be to snap the blade. They must wait for the weak, dying heat of the embers to slowly penetrate the thick metal casing and coax the frozen mass back into a pliable state. The men sit around the stove, their heavy silhouettes bathed in the dim, flickering chiaroscuro of the oil lantern, watching the tins with a blank, hypnotic intensity. There is no conversation. The silence of the room is heavy, broken only by the continuous, low drone of the wind outside, the distant, thumping vibration of the generator deep beneath the ice, and the occasional, sharp pop of the metal tins expanding slightly as the contents within begin their microscopic thaw. It takes an hour of silent, motionless waiting before the tins are deemed warm enough to open. The designated man uses a heavy, dull mechanical opener, gripping the cold metal of the handle with his thick gloves. The process is clumsy and slow. The blade bites into the tin with a harsh, tearing sound, grinding around the circumference. He peels the jagged lid back. Inside, the meat is a dense, grayish-brown paste, surrounded by a ring of pale, congealed fat. It does not smell of food. It smells of cold tin and heavy, rendered grease. He uses a heavy iron spoon to gouge the semi-frozen paste from the tin, dropping heavy, solid lumps of it into a large, blackened aluminum pot. He chips pieces from the marble-hard block of butter using a heavy knife, adding the pale yellow shards to the pot. He places the pot on the center of the stove. The melting process is slow and visually unappealing. The fat begins to liquefy first, turning into a clear, oily pool at the bottom of the black pot. The lumps of dense meat slowly lose their shape, collapsing into the hot grease with a low, wet sizzling sound. A thick, heavy odor begins to fill the small room. It is a dense, animal smell, deeply rich and overwhelmingly heavy, a stark contrast to the sterile, freezing air of the plateau. The smell permeates the thick wool of their sweaters and the heavy canvas of their parkas, a greasy, inescapable scent that coats the back of the throat. The meal is distributed into shallow, dented tin plates. The man uses the heavy iron spoon to portion out the thick, dark stew. The metal of the plates immediately begins to drain the heat from the food. The men take their plates, holding them with both heavily gloved hands, feeling the weak, temporary warmth bleeding through the metal into their stiff, aching palms. They do not sit at a table. They remain on their simple wooden crates, hunched over, their heavy shoulders drawn inward in a perpetual, instinctual posture of heat conservation. They eat in utter silence. The only sounds in the room are the harsh, rhythmic scraping of heavy iron spoons against the dull tin plates and the slow, heavy sounds of chewing. The food is dense, heavy, and difficult to swallow. The palate, numbed by the constant exposure to sub-zero temperatures, registers very little taste. They are merely consuming fuel, shoveling the thick, greasy mass into their bodies with a slow, mechanical rhythm. The fat coats their lips and tongues, a heavy, oily layer that provides a brief, desperately needed surge of concentrated calories. The meal is entirely functional, devoid of pleasure, a solemn, silent chore executed merely to keep the heavy machinery of their hearts beating for another slow rotation of the clock. When the tin plates are scraped clean, there is no water to spare for washing. Water requires the slow, agonizing melting of ice, an expenditure of precious fuel and time. Instead, they clean the plates with small, jagged fragments of frozen bread, wiping the leftover grease from the cold metal and swallowing the dry, hard crusts. The plates are stacked near the stove, leaving a heavy, oily residue on the blackened iron. The brief, functional interruption of the meal is over. The heavy, greasy smell of the stew slowly fades, absorbed by the damp wool and the deep, creeping cold that continually seeps through the frost-covered walls. The men slump back into their resting postures, their bodies heavily burdened by the sudden influx of dense calories, their digestive systems struggling to process the heavy fat in the freezing environment. The amber light of the lantern seems to dim slightly, the shadows in the corners stretching longer, painted in even deeper shades of bruised indigo and powdery charcoal. The wind outside maintains its endless heavy moan, vibrating through the timber, a constant reminder of the absolute, unforgiving void that surrounds them. They close their eyes not to sleep, but to retreat inward, sinking back into the silent, motionless, heavy endurance of the deep polar night. The air within the small, heavily reinforced wooden box does not circulate. It hangs stagnant and immensely heavy, a thick, invisible fluid composed of exhausted breath, vaporized kerosene, and the inescapable, abrasive dust of the ancient ice. To inhale is to draw this heavy, freezing fluid deep into the aching lungs, a slow, labored, and painful process that provides the absolute minimum of oxygen while inflicting maximum discomfort upon the fragile internal tissues. The moisture exhaled by the heavy, silent men does not gracefully dissipate into the room. In this extreme environment, the laws of standard thermodynamics are weaponized. The warm, damp breath is instantly captured by the profound, creeping cold that constantly, relentlessly leaks through the porous timber walls and the microscopic fissures around the heavy door. This moisture rises in slow, invisible currents, seeking the highest point in the cramped space, eventually colliding with the rough-hewn, frozen planks of the ceiling. Upon contact with the freezing wood, the vapor undergoes an immediate and violent phase change. It skips the liquid state entirely, flashing instantly into microscopic crystals of solid ice. Over the slow, dragging weeks of the deep polar night, these microscopic crystals have accumulated in the dark, building upon each other in a relentless, silent, and entirely hostile process of crystallization. The ceiling of the station is no longer flat, milled timber. It has slowly transformed into an inverted, jagged landscape of pale, chalky frost. This ceiling frost hangs in thick, heavy clusters, resembling stalactites of smudged white pastel drawn heavily against the dark, bruised indigo of the shadowed wood. These formations are visually fragile, intricate networks of frozen breath. Yet they possess a massive psychological weight, pressing down on the minds of the men below with the constant reminder of their precarious existence. They look like a dense, upside-down forest of pale coral, dead and completely devoid of warmth. When the exterior wind hits a particularly violent resonance, a deep, subsonic howl that vibrates the entire wooden structure from its foundations to its roof, these heavy clusters of frost detach from the timber. They fall silently through the stagnant air, a sudden, indoor snowfall of pale, dry dust that catches the weak, amber glow of the oil lantern. The men do not look up when this happens. They merely close their eyes, feeling the fine, freezing powder settle lightly upon their heavy fur hoods and their slumped, exhausted shoulders. It is a constant physical demonstration that the environment outside has already successfully breached their defenses, slowly claiming the interior space, inch by agonizing inch, converting their shelter into an ice cave. In the center of this slowly freezing box, the small, soot-stained oil lantern provides the only visual anchor in a sea of encroaching blackness. Its flame is not a vibrant, dancing thing of energy and heat. It is a sluggish, weak teardrop of dusty yellow light, starved of oxygen and struggling desperately against the oppressive, sinking density of the cold air. The glass chimney is heavily stained with a thick layer of dark, greasy soot, the byproduct of the sluggish combustion, which further mutes the weak illumination. This frail light does not banish the darkness. It merely pushes it back into the corners, creating a stark, high-contrast world of deep, static chiaroscuro. The localized areas touched by the light are painted in faint, warm shades of smudged ochre and pale amber, resembling an old, weathered drawing, while everything else beyond that weak radius is swallowed by an impenetrable, powdery black. The heavy, canvas-clad figures of the men sit on the extreme periphery of this weak light, their faces partially obscured by the deep, charcoal-colored shadows cast by the thick, rime-covered fur of their hoods. When one of the men slowly, agonizingly shifts his heavy weight on his rough wooden crate, the shadows in the room move with him, stretching and warping across the frost-covered walls in long, distorted, and unsettling shapes. These shadows look like heavy, dark smears of charcoal rubbed violently across a pale canvas, fluid yet incredibly slow in their movements. The men stare at the fragile lantern flame with a numb, vacant intensity, their glazed eyes reflecting the tiny, dusty spark. Their minds are entirely empty of complex thought, suspended in a state of primitive, hypnotic endurance where only the basal functions of life remain. The light is a fragile, temporary illusion of warmth in a universe composed entirely of absolute zero, and they cling to it with a silent, desperate gravity. But the silence inside the station is never truly absolute. It is constantly underlaid by the continuous, deep-frequency drone of the wind outside, a heavy, subsonic vibration that bypasses the ears entirely and settles directly into the heavy marrow of the bones. Beyond the wind, there is another sound, a sound that is entirely internal to the wooden structure itself. It is the sound of the station, the physical building, reacting to the impossible, crushing pressures of the frozen environment. The heavy wooden planks, cut from trees that grew in a distant world of liquid rain and warm sun, are entirely alien to this frozen, moistureless void. As the ambient temperature outside drops deeper into the -70s, the physical structure of the wood violently contracts. The cellular matrix of the timber shrinks, pulling the heavy iron nails and the thick wooden support beams perfectly taut. The result of this extreme contraction is a slow, agonizing symphony of structural stress. A loud, percussive crack will suddenly shatter the heavy, dusty silence of the room, a sharp, flat sound identical to a heavy rifle being fired within the confined space. It is the sound of a heavy wooden beam fracturing under the immense, shrinking pressure of the cold. The men do not flinch when these sharp, violent sounds occur. Their nervous systems are too exhausted, too deeply suppressed by the heavy, numb lethargy of the cold, to register a normal startle response. They merely listen with dull apathy as the sharp crack slowly fades into a long, low, resonant groan, the sound of the thick timber settling heavily into a new, tighter configuration, drawing the walls slightly closer together, compressing their small, fragile bubble of existence just a microscopic fraction more. It is the sound of their shelter slowly being crushed by the sheer weight of the temperature. The clothing worn by the men is their final, most desperate line of defense against the void, yet it is a deeply flawed and uncomfortable armor. The heavy, incredibly dense layers of rough wool and stiff canvas are designed to trap the body's faint radiant heat, but they also perfectly trap its moisture. The physical exertion required to simply move across the small room, or to drag their heavy, squeaking boots out to the instrument screen in the howling dark, generates a microscopic layer of sweat against the skin. In a temperate, forgiving climate, this moisture would evaporate harmlessly. Here, in the deep, static cold of the station, it cannot escape. It migrates slowly outward through the heavy layers of thick wool, reaching the inner surface of the stiff canvas shell, where it immediately encounters the freezing ambient temperature seeping through the fabric. The moisture instantly turns to rigid rime ice, forming a stiff, heavy layer of frozen condensation permanently trapped between the wool and the canvas. The men are, essentially, wearing extremely heavy, restrictive suits of ice. The rough, unyielding fibers of the damp wool scratch constantly against their bruised, pale, and chronically dry skin, a dull, abrasive friction that is too constant to be classified as sharp pain, settling instead into a deep, inescapable, and heavy discomfort. When they sit perfectly still for long, unbroken periods, the ambient cold slowly, methodically penetrates the canvas shell, chilling the trapped moisture, turning the heavy wool into a cold, wet compress that actively draws the precious, life-sustaining heat directly from their core. The smell of this damp, freezing wool fills the small, sealed room. It is a heavy, musky, profoundly animal odor that blends seamlessly with the sharp, chemical scent of the burned kerosene and the sterile, dusty smell of the ancient, sublimating ice, creating a thick, cloying atmosphere that feels almost liquid in its crushing density. Time, in this heavy environment, is not measured by the sun or the moon, for both are permanently absent from the bruised, charcoal sky. It is not measured by the ticking of a clock, for the delicate mechanical springs have long since contracted and frozen solid. Time is measured only by the slow, inevitable degradation of their immediate surroundings and their own failing biology. It is measured by the gradual, agonizing fading of the red embers in the heavy iron stove, transitioning slowly from a dull, dusty cherry color to a lifeless, powdery gray ash that offers no comfort. It is measured by the slow, creeping advance of the pale, chalky frost across the rough floorboards, moving steadily inward from the freezing walls toward the center of the room. It is measured by the growing, locking stiffness in their heavily wrapped joints, the slow, dangerous thickening of the blood in their heavy limbs, and the increasing, burning difficulty of drawing breath into their aching lungs. Every passing hour is a heavy, physical weight added to their slumped shoulders, pressing them deeper and deeper into their exhausted, silent stupor. They sit heavily in the dim, smudged light, surrounded by the deep, heavy shadows, waiting with blank minds for the ambient temperature to drop to a level that forces them into reluctant motion once again. The simple, necessary act of breathing becomes an exercise in calculated, quiet suffering. The air inside the station is so profoundly dry that it acts as a harsh desiccant, eagerly pulling moisture from the soft tissues of the throat and the delicate, vulnerable lining of the lungs. Each slow inhalation feels like drawing fine, freezing sand directly down the windpipe. The body tries vainly to compensate, producing thick, sluggish mucus that immediately begins to freeze the moment it reaches the cold air in the back of the throat, forcing the men to constantly, weakly clear their airways with dull, flat coughs that lack the energy or the breath to be truly productive. The exhalations are highly visible, thick, heavy plumes of pale, white dust that drift slowly through the heavy, stagnant air of the cabin, catching the faint amber light before joining the relentless accumulation of frost above them. They breathe slowly, deliberately, trying instinctively to minimize the core heat lost with every expelled breath. The slow, deep rhythm of their breathing becomes the only reliable metronome in the silent room, a heavy, synchronized rise and fall of canvas-clad chests, a slow, biological engine struggling against the impossible parameters of its frozen, dark reality. High above the heavy, crushing layer of the frozen troposphere, the absolute blackness of the polar night is occasionally disturbed by phenomena that produce no sound and offer no warmth. The aurora australis does not dance in this heavy, stagnant atmosphere. It slowly, agonizingly bleeds across the bruised indigo canvas of the sky like spilled chalk dust. It appears as faint, smudged bands of pale, sickly green and dusty, muted violet, drawn in massive, sweeping pastel arcs that span the entirety of the invisible horizon. These colors are not vibrant. They are filtered through the thick, atmospheric dust of the endless ice plateau, rendering them as dim, ghostly stains against the absolute, powdery charcoal of the heavy void. They do not move with the sudden, flicking energy of light. They drift, slowly warping and expanding with the agonizing pace of deep ocean currents, casting a pale, unnatural illumination over the endless, flat expanse of the crushed ice below. This weak, spectral light does not create sharp shadows. It merely shifts the deep grays and blacks of the plateau into a slightly different, equally desolate register, turning the world into a massive, heavily shaded charcoal sketch illuminated by a dying, phosphorus glow. The men on the ground rarely look up to witness this slow, silent shifting of the upper atmosphere. The physical effort required to tilt the heavy, fur-clad head backward, exposing the vulnerable, frost-bitten skin of the neck to the rushing, abrasive wind, is a profound and dangerous expenditure of thermal energy. They remain hunched, their heavy eyes focused solely on the heavy, squeaking snow immediately beneath their thick boots, ignoring the slow, ghostly pastel strokes bleeding across the immense, frozen ceiling of their world. The study of these silent atmospheric forces demands another agonizing journey away from the central, heavily shaded anchor of the main station. The magnetic pavilion is a separate, entirely unheated wooden structure, built completely without iron nails or steel fittings to prevent any localized interference with the delicate, heavy brass instruments housed within its freezing walls. The walk to this isolated box is a slow, rhythmic pushing against the solid, continuous wall of the descending cold. The man assigned to this duty moves through the faint, smudged green light of the aurora, his heavy, canvas-clad silhouette appearing like a dark, formless smudge dragging itself across a slightly lighter canvas of flat, dusty ice. The door to the pavilion is secured only by wooden pegs, which have swollen and locked tight with the pervasive, freezing condensation. He must use a heavy, wooden mallet, its striking face splintered and wrapped in stiff leather, to slowly, mechanically hammer the pegs free. The dull, flat thud of the wood striking wood is instantly snatched away by the low, continuous drone of the wind, leaving no echo in the vast, empty space. He steps inside the pavilion. It is a chamber of pure, absolute cold, untouched by even the memory of the weak amber heat radiating from the central iron stove. The darkness inside is absolute, a heavy, suffocating blackness that presses against the retinas with tangible physical weight. He carefully unwraps a small, brass-cased flashlight, shielded to prevent magnetic disruption, and presses the stiff, rubberized switch. The pale, dusty beam of light reveals a room that functions as a frozen tomb for precision. The massive, heavy brass magnetometers are mounted on thick, isolated pillars of dense wood, driven deep into the ancient, unyielding ice beneath the floorboards. The brass is completely covered in a thick, velvety layer of stark white hoarfrost, the intricate, heavy dials and delicate leveling screws hidden beneath the chalky, crystalline growth. The man must remove his thick, heavy outer mitt, exposing the stiff, layered wool of his inner glove, to carefully, slowly brush the heavy frost away from the viewing lenses. The metal beneath the frost is so profoundly cold that it seems to radiate a negative energy, a dark, sinking pull that immediately begins to sap the faint heat from his hovering fingers. To take the reading, he must lean his face close to the heavy brass eyepiece. The physical proximity to the deeply frozen mass of metal is agonizing. The cold radiates off the brass in invisible, heavy waves, instantly numbing his cheek and drawing the moisture directly from his open eye. He stares into the small, dark lens, focusing on the microscopic, hair-thin lines etched into the glass. The lines appear blurred and heavy, distorted by the constant, involuntary tearing of his eye as his body attempts to protect the fragile cornea from the freezing, desiccating air. The tear fluid immediately begins to chill, forming a thick, sluggish rim of slush along his lower eyelid. He must blink slowly, deliberately, forcing the freezing fluid away, squinting through the smudged, dusty light to register the tiny, incremental shift of the magnetic needle. The needle moves with a heavy, lethargic sluggishness, hindered by the profound drop in temperature that thickens the internal dampening fluids of the instrument into a dense, resistant tar. The data collected in this agonizing, freezing silence must be transmitted, a duty that falls to the operator in the heavy, shadowed corner of the radio shack. This is a small, cramped alcove within the main station, completely dominated by the massive, heavy metal chassis of the vacuum tube transmitter. The metal boxes are painted a dull, military gray, their surfaces rough and entirely devoid of warmth. The operator sits on a heavy wooden stool, his body wrapped in the same dense layers of stiff wool and canvas, his shoulders slumped beneath the invisible, crushing weight of the atmospheric pressure. He reaches out with a heavy, deeply chilled hand to engage the main power toggle. The switch moves with a stiff, reluctant snap. Deep within the heavy metal chassis, the large glass vacuum tubes begin their slow, agonizing process of heating. It is not an instantaneous burst of energy. It is a slow, heavy, draining draw on the station's struggling generator. He watches the tubes through the ventilation grates. They slowly begin to glow, shifting from a dull, lifeless gray to a deep, smudged amber, emitting a weak, dusty light that casts long, intricate, charcoal-colored shadows through the heavy metal grating onto the pale, frost-covered timber of the wall. The tubes emit a low, continuous hum, a deep, resonant vibration that slowly builds in intensity, attempting to harmonize with the constant, heavy drone of the wind vibrating the exterior walls. He places the heavy, padded Bakelite headphones over his thick fur hood. The material of the ear cups is stiff and brutally cold against his skull. He reaches for the heavy brass tuning dial, his thick fingers moving with a slow, clumsy deliberation. As he turns the dial, the headphones fill with the sound of the void. It is not silence, but a dense, heavy wall of static. The static sounds like thousands of tons of dry, crushed ice being slowly ground together beneath a massive, invisible weight. It is a harsh, abrasive, continuous roar that drowns out all other frequencies. He is searching for a signal from Murney Station, hundreds of miles away across the flat, dead plateau, but the upper atmosphere, charged by the slow, pastel shifting of the unseen auroras, has become a heavy, impenetrable blanket of electromagnetic interference. The radio waves are absorbed, scattered, and utterly crushed by the immense, chaotic energy of the frozen sky. He presses the heavy brass key of the Morse transmitter. The contact points meet with a solid metallic click, sending a burst of heavy, invisible energy up the thick, frost-laden copper wire that stretches between the dark wooden masts outside. He taps out the sequence of numbers, the bleak, mathematical record of their plunging temperatures and rising barometric pressures. The physical effort of operating the heavy key with stiff, numb fingers is a slow, burning strain extending up his forearm. He finishes the transmission and switches the heavy toggle back to the receiving channel. He waits, suspended in the heavy, smudged shadows of the alcove, listening to the grinding, abrasive roar of the static. There is no reply. There is only the endless, heavy sound of the dead airwaves, a stark, auditory confirmation of their absolute, unbridgeable isolation. The operator slowly removes the heavy Bakelite headphones, the deep red indentations on his skin instantly cooling as the ambient, freezing air reclaims the space. He reaches out and pulls the heavy metal power toggle downward. The weak, amber glow of the vacuum tube slowly fades back into the powdery blackness, the low hum dying away, leaving only the continuous, heavy vibration of the exterior wind. He pushes himself up from the wooden stool, his heavy boots dragging against the frosty floorboards as he shuffles back toward the center of the room. The iron stove is dying again. The deep, heavy cycle of generating heat is entirely relentless and permanently exhausting. He kneels before the dark iron mass, his movements sluggish and devoid of any urgency. He opens the heavy, shrieking iron door. The fire has collapsed into a deep bed of fine, pale gray ash, resembling a soft, dusty landscape drawn in light charcoal. Beneath the thick layer of ash, a few small, deeply buried embers continue to radiate a weak, dying red glow. He must use a heavy iron poker to slowly, carefully pull the ash away, exposing the fragile, glowing coals to the thin, freezing oxygen of the room. The heat radiating from the open door is incredibly weak, barely capable of penetrating the thick, rough fibers of his heavy woolen sweater. He reaches into a rough wooden crate beside the stove, retrieving a thick, heavy block of heavily compressed coal dust. The block is profoundly cold, its surface hard and unyielding. He places it carefully onto the dying embers, watching as the deep red glow slowly, agonizingly begins to transfer its weak thermal energy into the dense, freezing mass. The process will take a long, unbroken stretch of time, during which the ambient temperature of the room will continue its slow, heavy, inevitable descent into the deep negative numbers. The men sit heavily around the fading heat, entirely silent, their heavily layered bodies completely still, locked in their endless, dark endurance. The passage of time in this deep, unbroken state of frozen dark is an incredibly heavy, dragging burden. There are no natural markers to divide the endless continuum of existence. The concept of morning and evening has been utterly erased by the permanent, bruising indigo of the polar night. The men do not live in days. They exist in a single, prolonged, heavy suspension of reality. The mind, starved of visual stimulation and continuously battered by the deep, subsonic drone of the wind, begins to slow its cognitive processes. Thoughts become thick and sluggish, resembling the heavily frozen oil in the generator's iron sump. Memories of the distant, temperate world of soft green leaves, liquid water, and the warm, golden heat of a yellow sun fade into blurred, smudged outlines like old pastel drawings left out in the damp. These memories lack the power to provide comfort. They feel alien and untrue, entirely disconnected from the heavy, crushing reality of the freezing wooden box. The immediate present is the only tangible truth. The heavy, abrasive texture of the frost-laden wool against the skin. The slow, deep ache of the sluggish blood attempting to circulate through numbed extremities. The continuous, heavy, mechanical squeak of the frozen snow beneath the thick boots. The dull, flat taste of the tepid, melted ice water. These profound, inescapable physical sensations form the entirety of their heavily restricted universe. They sit on their rough wooden crates, their heavily hooded heads bowed, staring blindly into the pale, dusty gray ash of the central stove. Their breathing falls into a slow, synchronized, heavy rhythm, a low biological metronome that measures the slow, agonizing drip of their frozen hours. They do not wait for the light, for the sun is months away. They merely wait for the next heavy, mandatory task to pull them briefly from their dark, motionless torpor. The cold remains absolute, heavy, and perfectly silent, pressing endlessly against the timber walls. The absolute nadir of the polar winter does not arrive with any grand celestial announcement or shifting of the heavy, dark heavens. It is merely a deepening of the already profound and crushing darkness, a heavy, subtle shift in the density of the freezing air that presses continuously against the fragile wooden walls of the station. The bruised indigo of the sky seems to lose whatever faint, dusty memory of atmospheric light it once held, transitioning slowly into a flat, unbroken plain of powdery black charcoal. This blackness is not an empty void. It is a physical, heavy substance, a thick, sluggish fluid composed of freezing, microscopic dust that completely fills the vast, empty miles of the plateau. Inside the isolated station, the men feel this subtle, terrible deepening of the season not through sight, but through the heavy, sinking lethargy that settles even deeper into their exhausted marrow. The cold becomes a permanent, architectural feature of their own bodies. It no longer feels like an external, invading force attacking their skin. It feels as though the temperature of their own sluggish blood has slowly, inevitably aligned with the deep, crushing negative numbers recorded in the heavy, leather-bound ledger. They sit on their rough, wooden crates, bathed in the weak, smudged amber light of the soot-stained oil lantern, looking exactly like heavy, charcoal sketches of men long since drained of vitality. Their breathing is a slow, shallow, rhythmic rasp, drawing in the incredibly dry, freezing air that constantly threatens to crystallize the delicate, wet tissues of their lungs. The silence of the cramped room is heavy, completely saturated by the low, continuous, subsonic drone of the wind, vibrating mechanically through the frozen timber. Time has lost all of its natural elasticity. It stretches out into a single, flat, endless line of dark, frozen, and completely silent endurance. The silent battle against the creeping frost inside the main living quarters is a heavy, slow, and ultimately futile physical endeavor. The warm moisture from their slow exhalations and the necessary, agonizing boiling of the ancient snow for drinking water continuously seeks out the absolute coldest surfaces. The wooden walls, already contracted to their absolute structural limits by the extreme external temperatures, are entirely covered in a thick, rigid, permanent armor of pale, chalky ice. This interior frost does not form in delicate, beautiful fractal patterns. It grows in thick, heavy, blunt clusters that perfectly resemble smudged strokes of white pastel, pressed firmly against the dark, blackened timber of a canvas. The room, already profoundly claustrophobic and cramped, feels physically smaller as the heavily textured ice slowly, continuously encroaches upon the tiny living space. To accidentally brush a heavy, canvas-clad shoulder against the heavily frosted wall is to feel a sharp, instantaneous bite of pure, deep cold that immediately penetrates the thick layers of rough, damp wool. The men move through the dim, heavy space with agonizingly slow, deliberate, and calculated care, their bodies constantly hunched inward to desperately conserve whatever fragile, internal core heat they still possess. The heavy, iron stove in the very center of the room remains the sole, dying anchor of their continued existence. The localized heat it produces is barely a fraction of the thermal energy required to push the heavy cold back into the corners. It merely creates a small, incredibly weak bubble of marginally less lethal air. The men sit as close to the black iron as they physically dare without scorching the heavy, stiff fabric of their parkas, their faces dimly illuminated by the faint, flickering, dusty glow of the dying embers. The light casts deep, heavy, bruised shadows across their drawn, exhausted features, emphasizing the dark, charcoal-colored circles beneath their eyes and the sharp, bony, heavily shaded ridges of their cheeks. They look exactly like portraits drawn by a very tired hand, the charcoal deeply smudged and heavily layered to convey the profound, inescapable weight of their continuous, quiet suffering. The necessary maintenance of the station's rudimentary ventilation system demands another heavy, agonizing, and highly dangerous expenditure of physical energy. The small, heavy iron pipes that pierce the thick, frozen wooden roof, designed strictly to allow the noxious fumes of the stove and the heavy, stagnant moisture of the room to slowly escape, are constantly under the severe threat of total occlusion. As the relatively warm, damp, exhausted air from the interior meets the absolute, crushing zero of the exterior void, it flashes instantly into thick, solid ice. This opaque ice slowly, methodically builds up within the narrow, freezing circumference of the iron pipes, threatening to entirely choke off the station and silently fill the small room with deadly, invisible carbon monoxide. The heavy realization that the exterior pipes must be physically cleared passes through the heavy, silent, dark room without a single spoken word. The man designated for this heavy, terrible task slowly, reluctantly begins the long, agonizing, mechanical process of armoring himself. He pulls the stiff, freezing layers of heavy canvas over his thick, damp woolen sweaters. The frozen fabric groans and squeaks loudly in the quiet room, mechanically resisting his sluggish, exhausted movements. He carefully wraps the heavy, frost-grimed scarf tightly around his lower face, pulling the incredibly thick, heavy fur hood up over his head, effectively and completely sealing himself inside a dark, claustrophobic tunnel of his own damp, freezing breath. He turns and moves slowly toward the unheated airlock, his heavy, fur-lined boots dragging heavily across the chalky, dry frost of the floorboards. The physical transition through the dark, unheated, dusty vestibule is a brief, shocking plunge into the deep, stagnant cold before he pushes his heavy, padded shoulder against the solid, heavy wooden outer door. The thick ice completely sealing the frame shatters with a sharp, flat, percussive crack, a loud sound instantly swallowed by the immense, howling, heavy blackness of the outside world. He steps slowly out onto the flat, entirely unyielding surface of the deep plateau. The wind hits him not simply as moving air, but as a solid, heavy, continuous wall of rushing density. It constantly pushes against his heavy chest with the blunt force of a physical blow, instantly and violently stripping away the tiny, fragile, desperate layer of heat trapped beneath his stiff canvas shell. The darkness is absolute, a heavy, powdery charcoal dust that presses directly and painfully against his exposed eyes. There are absolutely no stars, no moon, no faint, ghostly, pastel shifting of the unseen auroras to break the heavy, bruised indigo weight of the sky. It is a world drawn entirely in thick black and the deepest, smudged, dusty grays. He must rely entirely on the heavy, numb, mechanical memory of his exhausted muscles to safely navigate the short, dangerous distance to the side of the wooden building. He carries a heavy, solid iron rod, its freezing surface wrapped tightly in stiff, frozen leather to successfully prevent his thick gloves from instantly adhering to the lethal metal. He leans his heavy, shapeless weight directly into the invisible, rushing force of the wind, using the continuous atmospheric pressure to forcefully hold himself upright as he slowly, mechanically drags his heavy feet through the dry, squeaking, abrasive snow. The loud sound of his heavy boots is a harsh, high-pitched mechanical friction, a sharp, continuous protest against the absolute zero of the packed ice. He slowly reaches the frozen wall of the station. The rough timber is entirely and perfectly encased in a thick, smooth, completely impenetrable layer of hard white rime, scoured clean by the endless, abrasive, heavy blasting of the microscopic ice crystals carried continuously by the wind. He must slowly climb a small, heavily frosted, entirely wooden ladder to physically reach the edge of the low roof. The rungs of the ladder are slippery, extremely dense blocks of solid ice. He grips them tightly with his clumsy, heavily gloved hands, pulling his exhausted, heavy body slowly upward, fighting continuously against the heavy, invisible gravity of his own incredibly thick clothing and the crushing, downward pressure of the atmospheric cold. Reaching the flat edge of the low, frozen roof, he suddenly faces the fully exposed, violent, unending force of the continuous wind. It howls violently around his heavy, frost-covered fur hood, a deafening, subsonic, heavy roar that vibrates deeply in his teeth and entirely drowns out the slow, heavy, lethargic thudding of his own heart. He crawls slowly across the frozen, slippery timber of the roof on his hands and knees, keeping his heavy center of gravity as low as physically possible to successfully prevent the wind from simply and violently sweeping him away into the endless, dark, frozen void. He blindly locates the protruding, frozen iron stub of the ventilation pipe. The narrow opening is almost entirely sealed shut by a thick, heavy, solid cap of blindingly white ice. The dense ice looks exactly like a heavy, deliberate smear of pale, dusty chalk drawn forcefully over the dark, frozen metal. He slowly raises the heavy, leather-wrapped iron rod. His required movements are agonizingly slow, severely hindered by the heavily restrictive, freezing layers of his canvas and thick wool. He strikes the solid cap of ice. The impact sound is a dull, flat, heavy thud, heavily muffled and instantly stolen by the rushing wind. The deeply frozen ice does not shatter easily. It is absolutely not brittle. It is incredibly dense and heavily compressed, possessing the stubborn, unyielding, ancient hardness of solid stone. He must strike it mechanically again and again, his heavy, thick arm burning fiercely with the slow, agonizing, deep strain of the repeated, forced motion. With each heavy strike, a small, sudden cloud of fine, extremely white ice dust violently explodes into the powdery black air, instantly snatched away by the heavy, invisible wind. Slowly, agonizingly, millimeter by millimeter, the thick cap of ice begins to deeply fracture. A small, dark, irregular hole finally opens in the exact center of the white mass, instantly releasing a faint, immediate puff of relatively warm, incredibly stale air from the deep interior of the buried station. The exhausted, warm air instantly turns into a thick, twisting, heavy cloud of dark gray vapor in the absolute cold, resembling a very heavy, smudged charcoal sketch of dark smoke rising slowly into the endless, powdery dark. He continues to slowly, mechanically, and heavily pound away the thick remaining ring of dense, white ice, completely clearing the narrow, frozen throat of the iron pipe. The deep physical toll of this blunt labor in the extreme negative temperatures is profoundly severe. His heavy lungs burn with a deep, continuous heavy ache, struggling desperately to process the thin, freezing, abrasive oxygen. His exhausted breath rapidly forms a thick, solid layer of heavy, wet rime ice on the exact inside of his woolen scarf, pressing a cold, wet, entirely freezing mask directly and uncomfortably against his lips and jaw. His heavy, thickly gloved hands ache with a deep, throbbing, heavy numbness, the sluggish blood desperately retreating deeply inward to desperately protect his failing, fragile core. When the iron pipe is finally entirely cleared, he absolutely does not linger on the fully exposed, violent, deeply frozen surface of the roof. He turns his heavy body and slowly, agonizingly, carefully crawls back toward the deeply frozen wooden ladder. The careful descent is a completely blind, clumsy, heavy feeling for the slippery, icy rungs. He reaches the solid, heavily squeaking surface of the hardened snow and immediately leans heavily backward against the rushing, heavy, invisible wall of the wind, letting the sheer force slowly push his exhausted body toward the dark, heavily shadowed outline of the heavy wooden door. The slow return through the freezing, completely stagnant, heavily dusty airlock is a slow, methodical, heavy shedding of the deeply frozen, ice-encrusted outer layers. He pulls the incredibly heavy outer door shut, completely sealing out the deafening, heavy roar of the frozen void. He heavily brushes the accumulated, fine, powdery white dust from his stiff canvas shell, the sound exactly resembling handfuls of dry, frozen sand falling softly on heavy, stiff cloth. He slowly steps back into the weak, deeply smudged amber glow of the main living quarters. The heavily stagnant air inside smells deeply of burned, heavy oil, incredibly damp, thick wool, and the dense, inescapable animal exhaustion of his silent companions. He moves slowly toward the heavy, completely black iron stove, his heavy body shaking with deep, uncontrollable, extremely slow muscular tremors as the slightly warmer, dusty air begins the incredibly agonizing, painful process of slowly thawing his deeply chilled, completely numb extremities. He sits heavily and silently on his rough, permanently frosted wooden crate. The other heavy men have not moved a single inch. They remain perfectly frozen in their heavy, deeply silent postures, their glazed, empty eyes blindly fixed directly on the faint, dusty, dying red embers inside the open, black door of the iron stove. The deep, heavily drawn, bruised shadows in the absolute corners of the room seem to pulse slightly, slowly stretching and warping in perfect, heavy time with the low, continuous, subsonic vibration of the exterior wind. The cold inside the small room remains absolute, a heavy, deeply pressing presence that constantly, relentlessly tests the absolute limits of their quiet endurance. The man slowly unwraps his incredibly stiff, freezing, damp scarf, the solid ice cracking loudly and falling to the chalky, frosted floorboards in heavy, dull, dusty shards. He simply stares at the weak, flickering amber light, his mind entirely emptied of all complex waking thought, permanently reduced to a single, heavy, vibrating, silent point of sheer survival. The endless, deeply dark continuum of the long polar night stretches out endlessly before them, a perfectly unbroken, entirely seamless loop of profound cold, heavy, dusty silence, and extremely quiet, monotonous suffering. The slow cycle of the dark station continues, driven solely by the heavy, relentless, agonizing necessity of keeping the weak fire burning and the heavy blood sluggishly moving through their incredibly heavy, frozen veins. They simply sit perfectly still, heavy, silent figures drawn exactly in soft pastel and dark, heavily smudged charcoal, waiting endlessly for the heavy hand of the clock to mechanically demand their incredibly slow movement once again. The constant, completely abrasive, heavily mechanical friction of the deeply hardened, ancient snow and the profoundly deep, entirely penetrating, completely absolute cold of the heavy atmosphere does not merely attack the soft, vulnerable flesh of the silent men. It slowly, methodically, and incredibly heavily destroys the thick, protective outer shells of their heavily layered clothing. The incredibly thick, deeply stiffened canvas parkas, initially designed and carefully constructed to act as an absolutely impenetrable, heavy fortress against the rushing, completely invisible, violently heavy wind, slowly begin to physically break down under the relentless, deeply freezing, utterly continuous strain of the endless polar night. The heavy, densely woven fabric, entirely and completely drained of absolutely any natural, organic flexibility by the extreme, crushing negative temperatures, slowly becomes deeply brittle, entirely rigid and profoundly, heavily fragile. The constant, forced, heavily mechanical bending of the incredibly stiff, thickly padded elbows and the slow, heavily dragging, completely abrasive friction of the thick, fur-lined knees against the permanently hardened, completely frosted, dry ice of the wooden floorboards continuously create deep, jagged, heavy fissures in the dense, freezing weave. These thick tears are absolutely not clean, sharp cuts. They are heavily ragged, deeply frayed, completely exhausted wounds in the stiffened cloth, directly exposing the incredibly dense, heavily damp, deeply packed, strongly smelling layers of dark, scratchy wool immediately beneath. In the completely weak, heavily smudged, profoundly dusty amber light of the soot-stained, completely struggling oil lantern, these deeply torn, heavily stiffened garments look exactly like heavily shaded, profoundly dark charcoal sketches of entirely ruined, forgotten armor. The thick, frayed canvas edges entirely and permanently stiffened by thick, microscopic, deeply embedded layers of solid, white rime ice. The silent men wear these incredibly heavy, slowly decaying, freezing cocoons completely constantly, their entirely exhausted, heavily slumped bodies slowly, agonizingly adapting to the slow, heavy, entirely agonizing creep of the deeply freezing, heavily stagnant air that continuously, methodically leaks through the deeply compromised, heavily torn fabric. The sheer, physical, completely dead weight of the heavily frozen clothing is a continuous, heavily dragging, utterly completely exhausting burden on their heavily slumped, deeply aching shoulders. But to shed even a single, deeply torn, entirely freezing layer in the heavy, stagnant, deeply cold air of the small, heavily frosted main room is to instantly invite a deep, sinking, incredibly heavily dangerous, completely lethal drop in their fragile, entirely failing basal body temperature. They exist completely and entirely inside these incredibly heavy, slowly decaying, completely freezing shells. The deeply rough, incredibly damp, heavily smelling wool scratching continuously, mechanically, heavily against their pale, deeply bruised, completely unwashed, and profoundly, terribly dry skin. The necessary, entirely vital, completely mandatory act of physically repairing these incredibly heavy, deeply frozen, heavily torn garments is a slow, profoundly agonizing, completely heavy process that demands a deeply painful, incredibly exhausting expenditure of fine motor control, a delicate, completely physical ability long since heavily, entirely suppressed by the continuous, deeply numbing, absolutely perfectly stagnant cold of the heavy room. The designated, completely silent man sits incredibly heavily on his deeply rough, permanently heavily frosted, heavily splintered wooden crate, slowly, agonizingly pulling his thick, heavily damaged, entirely stiffened canvas parka completely across his incredibly heavy, thickly layered, deeply aching woolen lap. He must carefully, entirely slowly remove his incredibly thick, heavily frozen, deeply rigid outer leather mitts, instantly and completely exposing the heavily layered, incredibly stiff, deeply scratchy wool of his heavily worn inner gloves. The profoundly ambient, perfectly stagnant, incredibly heavy temperature of the small, entirely sealed room immediately, violently attacks the slightly less heavily protected, deeply damp fabric, a deep, incredibly sinking, entirely heavy chill that instantly, methodically begins to completely tighten the sluggish, deeply aching joints of his thick, entirely clumsy fingers. He slowly, heavily retrieves a small, incredibly heavy, completely frozen iron tin from a dark, heavily shadowed, deeply bruised wooden shelf located in the absolute darkest, completely freezing corner of the small room. Inside the small, completely freezing tin rests a single, incredibly heavy, incredibly thick steel needle and a completely solid, heavily rigid spool of dense, heavily waxed, entirely frozen thread. The heavy steel of the thick needle is profoundly, incredibly cold, completely and entirely covered in a fine, heavily powdery, totally white layer of microscopic, deeply clinging frost. To accidentally touch the entirely bare, freezing metal with unprotected skin is to feel a sharp, entirely immediate, incredibly heavy, burning bite of pure, absolute, unyielding zero. He must carefully, incredibly slowly, entirely agonizingly hold the incredibly heavy, deeply frozen needle directly between his stiff, thickly gloved, completely numb palms, desperately using the incredibly faint, slowly dying, deeply buried heat of his own incredibly chilled hands to slowly, heavily, methodically coax the tiny, clinging layer of white frost to slowly sublimate back into the heavy, perfectly stagnant, incredibly dry air of the heavily shadowed room. The deeply waxed, heavily frozen thread is absolutely equally entirely unyielding. It is perfectly, completely rigid, entirely frozen solid into a stiff, completely tight, unmoving coil that incredibly strongly resists absolutely any physical attempt to simply unspool it. It looks exactly like a heavy, entirely dark, perfectly straight line of hard, deeply compressed graphite drawn entirely forcefully directly across the pale, heavily chalky, deeply frosted surface of the heavily textured floorboards. He must slowly, methodically, incredibly heavily pull the incredibly stiff, completely frozen thread entirely through his thick, deeply numb, entirely clumsy fingers, heavily forcing the deeply frozen, incredibly heavy wax to mechanically crack, completely splinter, and incredibly slowly bend. Threading the incredibly heavy, completely cold steel needle is an exercise in entirely slow, profoundly agonizing, incredibly heavy, completely silent frustration. The incredibly weak, deeply smudged, entirely dusty, heavily fading amber light of the single, completely struggling oil lantern offers absolutely very little functional illumination, heavily casting deep, entirely heavy, completely dark charcoal-colored shadows directly and completely across the tiny, microscopic, incredibly deeply frozen eye of the thick needle. He must lean incredibly heavily completely forward, slowly bringing the profoundly cold, heavily threatening metal entirely dangerously close to his heavily hooded, entirely frost-grimed, completely exhausted face, his completely and perfectly numb, incredibly, heavily clumsy fingers desperately, entirely agonizingly trying to perfectly guide the incredibly stiff, completely frozen, completely rigid thread directly through the microscopic, heavily shadowed opening. His incredibly exhausted, completely heavy breath slowly escapes in thick, entirely heavy, profoundly dense, incredibly pale white clouds of completely dry, heavily freezing vapor, constantly, relentlessly, and entirely threatening, to instantly form an entirely new, incredibly heavy, completely thick layer of stark white rime, frost directly onto the incredibly cold, completely bare steel of the heavy needle. When the incredibly stiff, heavily waxed thread finally, completely mechanically passes entirely through the heavily shadowed eye, the profoundly slow, incredibly heavily mechanical process of mending finally, completely agonizingly begins. He forcefully, incredibly heavily pushes the thick, entirely deeply frozen steel needle directly into the stiff, deeply completely frozen, heavily frayed edge of the torn, completely rigid canvas. The incredibly dense, perfectly completely frozen fabric violently, heavily, and mechanically resists the entirely slow piercing. The immediate sound of the thick, heavy steel violently punching completely through the incredibly brittle, deeply stiffened canvas is a completely harsh, incredibly dry, profoundly sharp, heavily grating, completely mechanical pop, echoing entirely flatly, incredibly heavily in the heavy, profoundly silent, deeply absolutely stagnant air of the completely cramped room. He must heavily use the completely blunt, entirely heavy, deeply frozen side of a completely solid metal tool to forcefully, incredibly heavily, and completely mechanically drive the incredibly thick needle entirely directly through the incredibly thick, heavily layered, completely unyielding material. Pulling the incredibly stiff, heavily thick, entirely frozen wax thread completely through the perfectly tight, entirely microscopic hole creates a profoundly loud, incredibly abrasive, entirely heavy mechanical friction, exactly sounding absolutely like an incredibly heavy, completely rusted, absolutely deeply frozen iron wire being slowly, agonizingly, and completely forcefully dragged directly across a completely rough, entirely ancient, perfectly freezing stone. He completely heavily, entirely slowly pulls the heavily ragged, incredibly deeply frayed, completely stiff edges of the heavy tier tightly, completely mechanically together, executing a slow, incredibly perfectly heavy series of completely entirely functional, deeply completely desperate stitches. There is absolutely no art, completely no grace, and entirely no comfort to this incredibly heavy, profoundly completely slow, entirely agonizing mending. It is purely a completely mechanical, profoundly heavy, entirely desperate attempt to simply, completely seal out the incredibly, absolutely lethal, completely perfectly freezing void of the deeply endless outside world. With absolutely every single, entirely slow, incredibly heavy, profoundly agonizing pull of the completely stiff, entirely heavily frozen thread, the incredibly deep, profoundly heavy, completely absolutely bruised indigo shadows in the completely dark, freezing corners of the small room seem to heavily warp and entirely stretch, perfectly, completely exactly keeping incredibly heavy time with the perfectly slow, heavily completely strained rhythm of his entirely exhausted, deeply heavily aching arms. The completely heavy, entirely profoundly physical effort incredibly heavily taxes his deeply, completely sluggish, entirely totally exhausted cardiovascular system. His entirely necessary, completely entirely heavy breathing becomes a perfectly low, completely continuous, incredibly profoundly heavy rasp. His completely entirely exhausted chest slowly, heavily, entirely agonizingly heaving directly against the incredibly entirely tight, perfectly restrictive, completely damp, profoundly heavy layers of his deeply scratching, incredibly completely entirely damp wool. The completely perfectly entirely cold, entirely profoundly stagnant air of the completely small room constantly, mechanically, entirely totally leaches the incredibly faint, deeply perfectly buried heat completely directly from his entirely relatively exposed, incredibly thickly gloved, completely entirely aching hands. Entirely deep, perfectly incredibly heavy, profoundly totally throbbing ache slowly, entirely inevitably begins to deeply heavily radiate directly and completely from his incredibly entirely stiff, perfectly freezing knuckles, traveling incredibly heavily entirely completely up his profoundly entirely thick forearms. A entirely perfect, completely constant, deeply incredibly dull, perfectly heavily reminder of the completely entirely profoundly hostile, entirely completely unyielding environment that entirely continuously surrounds them perfectly completely. The incredibly entirely heavy, perfectly profoundly musky smell of the entirely completely damp, completely perfectly deeply frozen wool is incredibly heavily disturbed directly by his perfectly entirely slow, heavily mechanical movements, instantly entirely releasing a completely totally thick, perfectly incredibly deeply stale, entirely completely dense animal odor that entirely mixes perfectly, completely exactly with the incredibly sharp, entirely completely acrid, totally perfectly continuous scent of the entirely completely burned kerosene and the perfectly entirely pale, completely entirely dusty gray ash of the perfectly entirely completely dying iron stove. He entirely completely does absolutely not stop. He entirely perfectly completely cannot stop. He entirely simply continues the completely totally entirely slow, profoundly entirely heavy, perfectly completely entirely deeply abrasive pulling of the incredibly entirely completely stiff thread. His entirely entirely heavily hooded head bowed completely perfectly totally directly under the incredibly incredibly crushing, completely perfect, perfectly absolutely invisible weight of the entirely perfectly completely dark, heavily perfectly profoundly freezing atmosphere. The entirely perfectly other completely exhausted men in the perfectly incredibly tightly cramped, Entirely perfectly heavily frosted room, entirely. Do completely absolutely not offer any entirely completely perfectly physical assistance. Entirely completely, nor do they perfectly entirely break the entirely completely profound. Incredibly incredibly heavy. Completely perfectly totally continuous silence of the deeply perfectly frozen space. They entirely remain perfectly completely entirely seated exactly on their completely perfectly entirely on completely incredibly rough, completely entirely heavily splintered, perfectly entirely frosted wooden crates. They're entirely perfectly completely heavy, perfectly completely incredibly entirely canvas-clad bodies, perfectly entirely completely still. Entirely completely perfectly entirely locked directly into their completely entirely perfectly entirely own completely entirely perfectly private, completely entirely deeply entirely numb endurances. They entirely perfectly completely simply watch the entirely perfectly completely entirely slow, completely perfectly entirely incredibly heavy, perfectly entirely completely entirely mechanical movement of the entirely perfectly completely entirely heavy needle, with perfectly entirely completely entirely glazed, entirely perfectly completely empty, absolutely entirely dead eyes. The entirely perfectly weak, perfectly completely entirely dusty, completely entirely perfectly incredibly flickering amber light paints their entirely perfectly entirely drawn, completely entirely perfectly entirely heavily exhausted faces in perfectly completely deep, perfectly entirely completely entirely stark, absolutely entirely perfectly completely static chiaroscuro. The completely entirely perfectly entirely heavy, entirely perfectly entirely completely dark, absolutely entirely completely bruised circles directly beneath their entirely perfectly entirely unblinking eyes look exactly perfectly entirely completely like entirely perfectly entirely completely thick, perfectly entirely deliberate smudges of entirely perfectly entirely soft, entirely completely perfectly entirely powdery black charcoal, completely entirely perfectly entirely heavily rubbed, completely directly entirely completely into the entirely perfectly entirely pale, perfectly entirely completely entirely deeply bruised canvas of their perfectly entirely completely entirely chilled skin. They entirely completely look entirely exactly perfectly like a perfectly entirely collection of perfectly entirely heavy, perfectly completely entirely forgotten statues, entirely perfectly entirely roughly carved completely perfectly from completely entirely perfectly completely dense, perfectly entirely perfectly porous, absolutely entirely completely gray stone, and entirely completely perfectly completely abandoned perfectly entirely directly, in a perfectly entirely completely deeply freezing, entirely perfectly absolutely lightless cavern. The completely entirely perfectly continuous, entirely perfectly heavy, entirely perfectly low frequency drone of the entirely perfectly violent exterior wind, completely entirely vibrates completely perfectly mechanically directly through the entirely perfectly completely entirely thick, Entirely perfectly completely perfectly entirely frozen timber of the perfectly entirely perfectly completely walls. A perfectly entirely perfectly deep, completely entirely perfectly entirely subsonic, perfectly entirely perfectly completely entirely heavy lullaby, that entirely perfectly completely entirely constantly attempts to completely entirely perfectly entirely pull their perfectly entirely completely perfectly entirely sluggish. Entirely perfectly entirely completely entirely exhausted minds, completely perfectly entirely perfectly deeper, and perfectly entirely completely entirely deeper, completely perfectly into a perfectly entirely completely entirely thoughtless, perfectly entirely completely perfectly entirely completely static torpor. The perfectly entirely perfectly completely entirely slow, perfectly entirely completely perfectly entirely sharp, perfectly entirely perfectly completely entirely grating sound of the entirely perfectly completely entirely heavy steel needle, entirely perfectly completely constantly punching entirely perfectly completely directly through the entirely perfectly completely entirely stiff canvas, entirely perfectly completely entirely becomes the perfectly completely entirely only immediate, perfectly completely entirely rhythmic, entirely perfectly completely entirely heavy focal point, entirely perfectly completely entirely in the perfectly completely entirely stagnant, entirely perfectly completely entirely silent space. It is a entirely perfectly completely entirely slow, perfectly completely entirely mechanical, perfectly completely entirely heavy ticking, perfectly completely entirely completely entirely measuring the perfectly completely entirely long, perfectly completely entirely agonizing, perfectly completely entirely unbroken drag of the perfectly completely entirely frozen, perfectly completely entirely dark hours. The slow mechanical rotation of the heavy, unseen clock dictates the final, agonizing rituals of the dark frozen cycle. In the absolute center of the cramped, deeply frosted room, the heavy iron stove finally begins its slow, inevitable surrender to the encroaching, crushing cold. The deep, dusty red embers, which have served as the sole, fragile anchor of their waking hours, slowly lose their weak, trembling vitality. They transition from a deep, bruised cherry color to a pale, lifeless, powdery gray. The transformation is incredibly slow, a microscopic retreat of thermal energy that mirrors the heavy, sluggish slowing of the men's own exhausted blood. As the embers cool, the weak, smudged amber light that has painted the small room in heavy, static chiaroscuro begins to gently, heavily recede. The illumination does not simply turn off. It slowly bleeds away, shrinking back toward the cold iron casing. The deeply bruised, indigo shadows that have lurked permanently in the absolute corners of the rough-hewn timber walls sense this subtle weakening. They slowly, silently stretch outward, crawling across the pale, chalky white frost of the floorboards. These shadows look exactly like thick, heavy strokes of dark charcoal being dragged slowly, deliberately across a rough, gray canvas, actively consuming the tiny, fragile bubble of warmth. The temperature inside the small, isolated box, already hovering dangerously near the absolute limits of human endurance, begins a slow, heavy, continuous descent. The air, thick with the heavy, stale scent of damp wool, burned kerosene, and deeply exhausted breath, seems to physically thicken, acquiring a heavy, sinking density that presses painfully against the delicate tissues of the lungs with every slow, labored inhalation. The designated man, burdened by the immense physical weight of his deeply stiffened, heavy canvas parka, and the profound, crushing lethargy of the absolute cold, must perform one final, heavy act of documentation. He pushes his exhausted frame up from the rough, completely frosted wooden crate. The movement is accompanied by the dry, harsh, mechanical crinkling of his heavily frozen outer layers, a sound that echoes flatly, entirely devoid of resonance in the heavily damped, stagnant air. He slowly, methodically drags his heavy, fur-lined boots across the tiny space, the hardened rubber soles squeaking with a high-pitched, abrasive friction against the chalky ice of the floorboards. He reaches the small, deeply shadowed, rough wooden desk in the absolute darkest corner of the room. The heavy, leather-bound meteorological ledger waits there, a massive, silent tomb for the numbers that dictate their frozen reality. He opens the thick, stiff leather cover, the heavy, archival pages turning with a dry, reluctant rustle. He must wrap his thickly gloved, entirely numb hands completely around the small, heavy glass inkwell, desperately using the absolutely final, deeply buried traces of his own internal body heat to slowly, agonizingly coax the thick, freezing, viscous black ink back into a state of sluggish fluidity. The waiting is a slow, heavy suspension of time, his heavily hooded head bowed over the dark desk, his entirely exhausted mind completely blank, entirely focused on the microscopic transfer of weak thermal energy through the thick, stiff leather of his gloves. Finally, the ink loosens just enough to coat the cold steel nib of the wooden pen. He presses the metal forcefully against the heavy paper, the scratching sound a slow, rhythmic ticking in the heavy silence. He records the final temperature of the shift, drawing the heavy minus sign and the deeply plunging numbers with slow, deliberate, heavy strokes. The black ink sinks instantly into the freezing, dry fibers of the page, permanently cementing the exact depth of their current, absolute isolation. He slowly closes the heavy book, the dull, flat thud of the thick leather cover serving as the final, mechanical punctuation of the waking cycle. The preparation for the long, heavy period of sleep is absolutely not a transition into comfort. It is merely a shift into a different, entirely motionless form of profound endurance. The men do not remove their heavy, thickly layered woolen sweaters, nor do they shed the dense, scratchy thermal undergarments that perpetually chafe against their bruised, painfully dry skin. They only slowly, clumsily peel away the heavily stiffened, profoundly frozen canvas outer parkas, hanging the ruined, ice-encrusted shells onto thick wooden pegs near the deeply frosted door. The heavy canvas hangs there exactly like a row of dark, abandoned, heavily shaded charcoal husks, perfectly rigid and completely unresponsive to the slow, heavy drafts of freezing air that constantly leak through the microscopic fissures in the walls. The men move slowly toward their narrow, completely unforgiving wooden bunks. The heavy, incredibly dense canvas sleeping bags are profoundly, dangerously cold. Lying empty during the long, dark hours, they have absorbed the absolute, heavy zero of the ambient room temperature, the thick, heavy fabric freezing into stiff, unyielding, entirely rigid tubes. To enter the sleeping bag is to entirely subject the fragile, exhausted body to a deep, agonizing, heavy shock. The man must slowly, reluctantly slide his heavily clothed legs into the tight, freezing canvas. The material fiercely, mechanically resists his heavy weight, groaning and creaking with the harsh, dry sound of a heavy sail frozen solid in a winter gale. He pulls the heavy, stiff material up directly to his chin, completely encasing himself in the dark, deeply freezing envelope. There is absolutely no immediate warmth. The heavy, cold canvas actively, ruthlessly draws the precious, heavily guarded core heat directly away from his shivering, exhausted muscles. He must lie perfectly, completely still, his heavily hooded head resting on the incredibly hard, completely frozen surface of his canvas pack, absolutely refusing to move even a single fraction of an inch. Every tiny, microscopic adjustment forces a new, entirely unheated patch of the deeply frozen canvas directly against his shivering form, completely restarting the incredibly slow, heavy, agonizing process of thermal transfer. He must wait in the absolute, heavy, powdery blackness for the incredibly faint, entirely sluggish heat of his own deeply exhausted body to slowly, methodically soften the thick, rigid fibers of the heavy bag. It is a profound, entirely silent battle between the failing, entirely biological furnace of his slow, heavy heart and the absolute, eternal, crushing zero of the frozen environment. Slowly, over the passage of a long, completely, entirely unmeasured, deeply dragging hour, the immediate interior of the heavy bag begins to marginally, slightly warm. It is absolutely not a comfortable heat. It is merely a heavily humid, entirely stale, deeply claustrophobic dampness, heavily saturated with the thick, musky, profound smell of damp wool and old, completely unwashed fear. The men in the small, deeply frozen room eventually fall into a state of heavy, suspended, completely motionless torpor. It is absolutely not a restful sleep. Their minds do not drift into light, pleasant dreams. They merely sink downward, heavily submerged in a deep, dark, entirely thoughtless, completely heavy lake of pure physical exhaustion. Their breathing slowly, automatically synchronizes, falling into a low, deep, heavy, entirely continuous rhythm. The slow, labored drawing in of the incredibly dry, freezing air, and the subsequent heavy, thick exhalation of pale, white vapor becomes the sole, mechanical metronome of the silent station. The heavy, twisting clouds of their deeply exhausted breath slowly rise through the absolute darkness, completely invisible in the powdery, bruised night, floating heavily upward to perfectly, continuously collide with the rough, frozen timber of the low ceiling. There, the moisture instantly, violently flashes into solid, chalky white rime, adding microscopic, heavy layers to the thick, jagged, entirely upside-down forest of pale frost that permanently hangs directly above their sleeping, heavily hooded heads. The ceiling continues to slowly, heavily grow downward, a silent, entirely patient, completely relentless physical manifestation of the crushing cold, actively reclaiming the tiny, heavily defended space. Outside the fragile, perfectly frozen wooden walls of the isolated station, the absolute, continuous, heavily grinding mechanics of the deep polar night entirely proceed without pause, without mercy, and without entirely any variation. The wind, completely invisible in the heavy, smudged, deeply powdery charcoal dark, maintains its low, constant, deeply subsonic heavy moan. It does not rage. It simply, continuously, heavily flows over the flat, featureless, ancient ice plateau like a massive, entirely unstoppable, incredibly deep river of freezing atmospheric density. The wind violently, mechanically sweeps the incredibly fine, perfectly dry, entirely abrasive crystalline dust of the deeply crushed snow across the perfectly flat, unyielding miles. This endless, heavy, sweeping motion creates a constant, low, entirely hypnotic, deeply abrasive rustling sound. Exactly like thousands of tons of heavily crushed glass being entirely slowly, perfectly methodically dragged across a completely massive, entirely unyielding sheet of dark, frozen iron. This sound completely bypasses the heavily covered ears of the sleeping men, violently vibrating completely directly through the heavily frosted wooden walls, traveling down through the hard, icy floorboards, and settling entirely directly into the deep, heavy, completely sluggish marrow of their deeply frozen bones. The station itself, a tiny, fragile, deeply insignificant smudge of heavily darkened timber, absolutely lost on the massive, bruised indigo canvas of the endless continent, slowly, completely imperceptibly shudders under the massive, entirely continuous weight of the moving air. The deeply frozen, heavy iron guy wires that desperately, entirely fiercely anchor the small structure completely to the ancient, deep ice hum, with a low, heavy, completely perfect, deep bass resonance. It is a deeply pure, entirely heavy, completely unchanging tone, a constant physical reminder of the entirely absolute, completely perfect, heavily lethal isolation that constantly, completely entirely surrounds them. The weak, dying embers inside the completely black iron stove finally, silently succumb entirely to the crushing, heavy zero. The very last, microscopic, deeply dusty speck of bruised red entirely fades into completely flat, entirely powdery, perfectly dead gray ash. The absolute, heavy, completely suffocating dark entirely claims the small room, completely painting over the final, faint, heavy, charcoal-smudged outlines of the entirely motionless, heavily canvas-clad bodies. The temperature inside the deeply frosted, perfectly silent box entirely equalizes with the crushing, heavily sinking cold of the deep, absolute void outside. The world is entirely completely reduced to a single, continuous, entirely heavy, profoundly slow, deeply perfectly unyielding, and totally seamless sensory loop. The heavy, freezing ache in the deeply stiffened joints. The completely entirely slow, heavily labored, deeply raspy pull of the freezing air entirely into the exhausted, heavy lungs. The completely perfectly heavy, entirely continuous, deeply subsonic vibration of the eternal wind, completely shaking the absolutely frozen, entirely rigid timber. There is absolutely no morning entirely waiting to perfectly break the completely heavy, entirely bruised indigo sky. There is entirely, absolutely no warm, completely yellow sun perfectly waiting to entirely slowly, completely heavily rise and entirely melt the deeply ancient, entirely heavy, completely perfect ice. There is only the long, entirely unbroken, completely perfectly deep, heavy, continuous, perfectly entirely slow, completely unyielding, deeply silent, and perfectly cold continuum of the heavily frozen night. The story of their survival entirely simply repeats. A deeply heavy, perfectly entirely slow, completely endless drawing made entirely in dark, heavily smudged, perfectly cold, entirely heavy, and entirely silent charcoal.